Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening all. Bonjour et bienvenue. A very warm welcome on behalf of MYT. We are very much looking forward to supporting you over the next 3 days with the Alliance for Malaria Prevention's annual partners meeting. So I'm now delighted to hand over to Jason to welcome you to the session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Debbie. And look, I wanted to start the 2020 AMP Partners meeting by welcoming all participants and all presenters to our meeting. Specifically, I wanted to start by thanking the heavy lift that Marcy and Eliza have done over the last months to prepare for this meeting and to have, what I know will be a very, very successful 2022 Partners meeting. I also just wanted to acknowledge the Maximize Your Time team who's done excellent work in helping us prepare, and our translation team, who some of you will be listening to right now. As well, this is our second virtual meeting, and as we start our 2022 Partners meeting, I just wanted to acknowledge all of the specific adaptations we've each done, but a number of you have done in more resource-constrained settings to the pandemic and how we work in the pandemic, and just acknowledge the challenges that's placed on us individually, on our families, and the people we've lost during this first phase of the pandemic. So over the next 3 days, we're going to cover 3 topics: ITN access, scaling up new types of ITNs, and COVID-19 adaptations and outcomes. And I think what's been amazing each year when we meet is we look back over the previous year and plan for the coming year. And I think what we've consistently seen has always been the power of this partnership and the successes of this partnership. And 2022 is no exception. Really what we've seen is the technical support, the adaptations AMP supported countries to do, and the technical support AMP has provided to countries has been critical to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. Our partnership has proven to be incredibly resilient and remarkable in its ability to adapt and change. In the coming weeks, we'll have the 2021 report out, but I was speaking to Marcy earlier today, and she mentioned last year was a massive year for AMP. The partnership supported countries to deliver over 180 million ITNs, which is just an enormous accomplishment. I also want to acknowledge the success we had in 2021 in terms of, we discussed for a number of years about a more flexible method of technical support. And both the UN Foundation and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have funded AMP to provide a lighter touch, shorter term technical assistance to countries. This has really been a critical step. As well, when we, just in advance of the pandemic, we met and we discussed this whole issue of should AMP transition to distance support. And I think what we've learned from this pandemic is while distance support is appropriate in a number of contexts, it by no way meets the needs of countries. And so it's been a very, very interesting exercise, but I think it's really taught us the importance and the power of that in-country technical support. So just a few more points from me, and it's really an encouragement. AMP very much needs country-level participation and country-level expertise to ensure our partnership stays dynamic, stays active, and we maintain a strong vision going forward. As well as we move through today's meeting and we look towards next year's meeting, it would be great to have input to say, what can we do going forward? If the pandemic were allow us to meet next year face-to-face, can we look at other models to allow participants to join from a variety of countries and just allow for larger participation? So what I'm going to do now is just, I'm going to hand over to Robert. Robert's going to be our chair for day 1. So Robert is the Officer Information Systems Monitoring and Evaluation at IFRC. And so Robert, I'll hand over to you and look forward to a wonderful meeting.
Thank you very much, Jason. And once again, a very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. And I'm delighted to chair this first day of the AMP Annual Partners meeting. And once again, you are all welcome to the meeting. So for our session today, we are mainly going to focus on the ITN access. As Jason said, we have 3 main focus areas for this Annual Partners meeting. And for today, we are going to focus on ITN access. We have presentations into 3 main sessions. And basically, as you all know, access is an important indicator for malaria control. And several surveys have established that net use is high among those who have access, and therefore there's a need for us to continue to increase access to ITN, to continue to increase access to ITNs. So our topics today have been broken into 3 different sessions. For the first sessions, it will be mainly highlighted on ITN coverage gaps and ITN durability. So we will have presentations from DMG and also from Hannah, who will be talking mainly on ITN durability. After the first session, we will have a break session, a short break, and then we'll go into have discussions after each of the first sessions. Then the second session will focus on the use of digital tools. We all know how digital tools are important and how various programs and various interventions are using digital tools in order to increase access. And we mainly to focus on the use of geospatial technologies with presentations from Gavi and WHO. After these 2 sessions as well, we have a round of discussions, and then we go on break. Then the last session will focus mainly on the use or how ITNs are distributed in complex operating environments. And this will focus presentations from DRC and also Flowminder on various interventions that they are doing on how ITNs can be distributed through the complex operating environments. Then we have a last session which will focus on PBO net dive, or the market landscape and short-term forecast for ITNs. So this will be the various presentations that we have. After each of the sessions that are listed, we will have a short discussion for about 20 minutes. Please feel free to put in your questions as the presentations are going. And then after the presentations, we have a summary of the day's presentation, and we will have the chance to also brief you on the discussions for tomorrow or the preceding day's activities. Now, let me welcome you to take a very quick poll, as we want to hear from you for the next 3 days as we do this conference. So I will invite MIT to show the slides for the poll. We will be using a virtual tool called Mentimeter. Please kindly go to www.menti.com. You may, if you are using a dual screen or if you are using just your laptop, you may enter the website address over there as has been put on the link. Please kindly go to the website, either on your on your phone or in your laptop, and enter the code that comes up. After you go onto the link, you see a code there. We want to hear from you. So you may go on there and enter the code, which is 84695042. 84695042. So we want to hear from you from where each participant is coming from today. So in the pool, if you have been able to enter through the menti.com, you see the questions coming, which country you are coming from. So I see Ghana, USA, Switzerland, United Kingdom, Senegal, Nigeria, see Mauritius, Wisconsin, the Netherlands. Please keep them coming. We want to hear from more of you where you are coming from. I see Niger. We also see France. Please keep the questions coming or your input coming if you have. If you haven't entered yours, you go to www.menti.com. Great. I also see Kenya, the Netherlands as well, Mauritius, very well. Canada, Ethiopia, great. We also have people from Ethiopia. Can we have the code again? I think there's a request for the code. MIT, can you help us with the code in the chat?
Yes, so the code is 84695042, and we'll pop that in the chat. But we can keep this open, Robert, so people can keep adding their countries, and feel free to move on when you're ready as well. So thank you, that's great.
Great. Like Debbie said, we will keep it open. If you haven't been able to do it, I think I've seen Rwanda join now. And you can keep the post going as we go ahead. You just go onto the website, which is www.menti.com. It's very great to have people from different parts of the world joining this conference. And once again, you are all welcome to this partners meeting. Please note that after the meeting, all the presentations or the slides will be available on the AMP website, and also the meeting list or participants list, as well as various contacts will be shared. Once again, please, there is interpretation feature there. You may please go ahead if you haven't seen the interpretation. This meeting is being interpreted in both English and French, so you may go over there to select the language of your choice. There is a hand up. Don't know if Dr. Diallo. Dr. Diallo, can you put your question in the chat? Or if it's a wrong hand, please lower your hand.
If you like, Robert, we can try and communicate with Dr. Diallo behind the scenes and then
All right, great, great. Thanks for
thank
that.
you.
Good. So to begin our presentations for the day, I would like to invite Marcy Erskine from IFRC and Malaria Programs Manager, and also the technical lead for AMP, and also Mary Kante from Euclair Consultant to give us a presentation on the ITN trackers. Over to you, Marcy and Mary.
Great. So Mary and I are going to do a very short presentation to keep us a bit on time on the ITN campaign and continuous distribution trackers. So next slide. Mary, you have control. Yeah, thanks. So really, I mean, I think the focus of today, it's clear we're focused on ITN access. The graph shows very clearly from the World Malaria Report in 2021 that we're not on track for sustaining access. And I know Amelia and Hannah are going to speak to this in their session shortly. Next slide. So AMP has worked for a number of years, I think everyone knows, on the ITN campaign tracker. And if MYT could put the link into the chat, that would be great. The ITN campaign tracker is really to provide an overview of the planned ITN campaigns, the quantities and types of ITNs, and then the status of those campaigns. Part of the objective of this is really to allow us to identify critical bottlenecks that need to be resolved through partner support. So really, this is a tool for all of us to try to keep campaigns on track. It's also a tool to improve the visibility of the ITNs that are planned across the different channels. And we recognize that focusing only on campaigns was only giving us a small picture of what's happening and not a good picture of where we need to be as we move forward on really talking about sustaining ITN access. And finally, the trackers really support the RBM partnerships work, which is an amazing amount of work from Sarah and the team on tracking ITN campaigns for the Global Malaria Dashboard. So we hope that the continuous distribution tracking will be added also probably in the next few months. So next slide. So what we do for the campaign trackers, we work with national malaria programs to collect and verify the information about ITNs that have been procured. This information is slightly different from the net mapping project. And I just wanted to touch on John Milner's work, where his work really focuses on the ITNs that have been shipped from a supplier. Our numbers for the campaign are specific to the campaign, and they're really on what's been procured. And so we'll always see a discrepancy between John's data and the campaign data because we don't have the continuous distribution included. We've worked to include subnational information as applicable. So when you go to the link, you'll see that some of the countries are live for subnational information, others are not, and that's because we don't have permission or we haven't verified data with those countries to be able to make it public. We're collecting some key data points. So the target population, when it's available, I think we'll talk a little bit about quantification later, and the target population isn't always aligned to ITN quantities. And then ITN types by broad categories, so standard LLINs, PBO, and dual AI, so not going into brand names or manufacturers. And then the funding partner or partners for those campaigns. And then the campaign phase and status, which is really predefined, so macro, micro, the different levels of planning. And then finally, we are indicating on the tracker whether a country is planning digital data collection and the scale of that. But you won't find detail on that digital data collection transition in this tracker. We are tracking that elsewhere to be able to identify some of the bottlenecks that countries are running into. Next slide. So some of the challenges I think we have with the campaign tracker, and I think Mary will come to some of these too, it's a living document and regular updates are needed as changes occur. And it's really challenging for us to ensure that accurate information is available and that the subnational data is correct. In addition to that, we have very, very good contacts for Sub-Saharan Africa and a few limited countries outside of Sub-Saharan Africa. So we would really encourage countries that are outside Sub-Saharan Africa to get in touch with us, because we find it very difficult to keep information up to date for countries that are not on the high burden continent. We don't always have population, as I mentioned, and it's not always linked to the ITNs procured. And this is because our methods of ITN quantification are varying quite a bit across countries now. And then we know that the campaign status can be sensitive. So we really want to encourage national malaria programs to view the status as a means for generating partner support. It's not a way of blaming a national program or a partner that things are off track. It's rather a way for us to identify where as partners we can move in to resolve some critical bottlenecks and keep things moving forward. And I think, Mary, on that, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Marcy. And hello, everyone. Great to join today. And I'll share a brief update on the ITN continuous distribution tracker, which is in progress. And for the objective in the first bullet point, as Marcy mentioned, ITN access has been declining in recent years, and we know that this is likely due to a number of factors, including insecticide resistance, ITN quality and performance, as well as the many operational challenges that we know well for increasing ITN access, both through campaigns as well as maintaining ITN access through continuous distribution, including things such as stockouts and ANC or EPI clinics, other logistical challenges, and also really the limited scale in many countries of continuous distribution through other channels, often due to funding and other limitations. So in response to these operational constraints, the objective of the ITN continuous distribution tracker is really to work with national malaria programs and partners to compile and use available data on the different channels that are in place for continuous distribution of ITNs, and really is a tool for advocacy at national and global levels to illustrate the needs for increased investments and focus on continuous distribution as an important avenue for maintaining access to the ITNs. The key data points in the tracker, which have been developed and are continuing to be refined, really with many thanks to many partners who have been involved and several national malaria programs as well. We have also population estimates for total population, those targeted to receive ITNs, pregnant women, children under 5, children under 1, as appropriate for channels in those countries, as well as looking at the targets that countries have set in their national strategic plans and other documents for the percentage of the population that they would like to reach. And lastly, several columns as well that we'll see in the next slide, looking at both ITNs planned for continuous distribution as well as distributed, and looking at those by the different channel types, by the type of ITN, as well as by the donor. So in the next slide, we'll see just a quick snapshot. The tracker continues off to the right, but this just gives a snapshot of what the tracker is looking like. We have one Excel worksheet for each country, and we are continuing to refine it with countries as we talk with national malaria programs, because we want it to be reflective of their needs. And as you see also in the bottom left, we also have a chance to have notes for the different data sources, so we know where the information is coming from. And in terms of progress to date, we've organized several meetings and exchanges, and again, with many thanks to all of the partners and malaria programs involved, with Global Fund, with PMI, with WHO, with the PMI Vector Link project and others, to develop the draft CD tracker template, and to also align with any other trackers and initiatives that are out there. We have worked with national malaria programs in several countries. We've also identified publicly available data, both from the PMI MOPS and from Global Fund gap analyses. And we've done an initial population of the tracker and shared it with 12 national malaria programs. And we're in the process of, or have been in the process for several months of organizing deep dive calls with several national malaria programs and partners to look at the tracker, ensure that it is meeting the needs of the countries, refining the tracker template, and really in the process now of populating the tracker with 2021 data and hopefully soon finalizing several of those and reaching out to additional countries. In terms of the challenges, it really is that fundamental piece of finalizing the data. As Marcy mentioned, this is an ongoing issue of ensuring that the data is continually available. And in this case, ensuring with countries that we have the final data. In some cases, DHIS2 provides a good initial look at the data, but in some cases it's also partial results and additional information is needed. And as we move into the layers of refining, finalizing, and validating the data with national malaria programs, as can be imagined, there are challenges and a little bit of sensitivity in some cases about finalizing, but huge thanks to all of the partners and the leading national malaria programs who are helping with this. We are moving forward with several countries and hope to have final data soon for several countries. And a request to this group, if anyone would like to participate in working with us in bringing your country's information into the tracker, we would love to work with you, and I will pop my email into the chat as well. With that, I'll turn it back over, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, Mary and Marcy, for the presentation on the trackers. I would like to remind you that you can put all your questions in the chat. If you have any question for any of the presentations, please put it in the chat. The next presentation will be from Amelia Victosi Vela, who is with the Institute for Disease Modeling, as a senior research scientist, and she will be presenting on the modeling potential drivers of ITN coverage gaps in sub-Saharan Africa.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here to share some estimated modeling results of ITN coverage and to get your insights and discussion. So with that, most of what I'll be discussing today, sorry, advancing, there we go, is also going to be included in this paper that we put out last year. So I will give a relatively brief overview, really focusing on the results, but please do see this document for a lot more information, and please reach out to me. Would love to have a continued discussion. So I'm sure that these are all, definitions that we know, but just because I'm one of the first meetings of this whole session, let's go ahead and go over some definitions to make sure everyone's on the same page when we're talking about access to ITNs. This is who could potentially sleep under a net. The use here I'm going to refer to as the proportion of people who do actually sleep under a net. And I think that folks will often have a different term for what I'm going to call the use rate. So here the distinction is the use among those with access compared to just the use overall, and nets per capita is fairly self-explanatory. So I'm just going to have a single slide here on the methods for our modeling, but again, please do read the paper for much more detail. So largely what we do in this analysis is use data sources from 3 different arenas to sort of triangulate to get these modeling results. So we use information from John Milliner at AMP to understand how many nets were delivered to countries by manufacturers, and then reported data from NMCPs on how many nets were distributed every year. And these for us put bounds on how many nets we could conceptually be distributed in a country every year. And then using that information, we also use data from large national surveys to understand how many nets are actually present in households at given points in time. And what that gives us is the ability to understand not only how many nets were distributed, but then also how quickly those nets are being discarded. And so this allows us to calculate an estimated net retention time by country. With that information, we get these national level time series of ITN access, use, and nets per capita. And then we can utilize, again, using these large national surveys we can use the spatial data in those surveys to disaggregate and generate these detailed subnational maps. So that is a combination of what I'll be showing today are these national time series, but then these subnational detailed spatial maps as well. So I'm going to dive straight into some results and give a big picture, and then hopefully not take too long so we can have time for discussion. So one of the primary results of this paper is that net use, again, those who are sleeping under a net, compared to the WHO target for universal coverage of 80%. In 2020, net use we are estimating was relatively low, and we can see that over the time series as well, where there are certainly some areas, especially in countries that have very recently had a mass campaign in 2020, where net use is very excitingly high, but overall there are major gaps in this analysis. But another big result was that perhaps looking at net use as a single metric is not the most fair, because it's also the case that we're estimating net access to be challengingly low. And so here, this red line now is showing the access of nets compared to the use of nets. And so what this is implying is that, of course, these two lines don't overlap, and we know that there are seasonal and other sort of risk assessment-based reasons why folks might choose not to use a net that they have access to, but that in the grand scale of trying to get to a higher access level for countries overall, if that is in fact your goal, you are seeing a bigger gap in terms of getting access to a high level than in terms of use. And this is just another way of looking at this information, where I put this access map again below, and then on the top here, I'm showing the use among those with access, so the use rate, showing that again, while there are some gaps in some areas and over some time periods, overall, it seems that net use is among those with access is relatively high. And just as a quick note before we get into these access challenges, I wanted to show these plots disaggregated by country. And we're not going to have time to really dig into this here, although I would love to in the discussion, but this is just again reinforcing that, first of all, there are some data gaps in some countries, which is worth acknowledging, but that the estimates that we are providing are showing that in most cases, you're seeing a much bigger challenge in terms of getting access up to a certain level than in terms of use among those with access. Which of course leads us to this immediate question, the source of many discussions today probably about, well, what are these challenges to access? And what our estimates suggest is that there are really two sort of complementary reasons on both the net distribution and then net retention side. So the first one of these is that our estimates are suggesting that because we are now at a point where very excitingly, these mass campaigns are distributing truly amazing numbers of nets to the communities, we're starting to see allocation challenges around nets. So the way that we're showing it in this plot is here on the x-axis, the number of nets per capita. So this is the actual volume of nets that are going into countries here just for 2020. And on the y-axis, we're showing the access that then comes out in the data. And here, because we are procuring hopefully about 1.8 enough nets for 1.8 people per net, you would hope that access and nets per capita would have this really nice linear relationship, which we see in settings where you're not distributing quite so many nets per capita. But once we get to these very high volumes of net distribution, we start to see this plateauing off, where suddenly, even though we're distributing large numbers of nets, we're not getting the same gains in access that we were at lower nets per capita. Another way of viewing this is saying, okay, if we count the number of nets that were distributed within a country in a given time period, if we imagine that those nets were allocated perfectly, right, such that everybody got exactly the number of nets that was anticipated based on that distribution, what would access be compared to what we're actually modeling access as being? And so in this plot, these blue lines are this sort of counterfactual estimate of what could access look like if there was perfect allocation. And then in the red line here is the access that we actually are estimating in this analysis. And so what we can see is that in some countries, there is a really substantial difference between those two estimates, which again suggests that there could be a substantial benefit to trying to understand and address these allocative challenges. So that's the distribution side of this puzzle. But also there is the challenge about net retention times. And we can see sort of in those plots about net access that there's often a very steep drop off in our estimates of nets being distributed, but then that access really falling quite rapidly. And a way to view this is, we're able to estimate by country what the median retention time is for the nets that are distributed. And so here, this is what this plot is showing, where here's every ISO 3 code for different countries. And the location of the code is showing the median net retention time with uncertainty bars around it. And I did want to acknowledge that these countries that are listed in red, we're estimating this whole time series with fewer than 3 national surveys. And so those results can perhaps be taken with a slightly larger grain of salt. But overall, what we're seeing is that there's a very large heterogeneity in our estimates between how long nets are retained on average in different countries, but that it is fairly common for these nets to be retained on average for a much shorter period of time than the 3 years that is running between these mass campaigns, really suggesting that there are real challenges to either net distribution timing, longer net retention, everything in this space. And I am far from the first person to have noticed this trend. I think that everybody in this room is very aware of this. And in particular, there's a wonderful paper from one of my co-hosts back in 2014 that I'll show in a moment about specifically this question. And so what I'm going to share in just my last few slides is a few preliminary results from work that I'm doing currently on net durability that we can take a look into moving forward. So again, just wanted to reference this lovely paper by Hannah and others from 2014 that is already showing that the primary reason for nets being lost is because they're being described as being too torn. And this really suggests that there might be a role for greater physical integrity and net durability in terms of increasing net retention times. So I'm really excited to hear more from Hannah and from you in the audience about your thoughts on this. But I have been doing some work with colleagues at the Institute for Disease Modeling, thinking about what type of burden reduction we might be able to expect from generating, from putting more durable nets into the field. There is a presentation at last year's Annual Society of Tropical Medicine on this, but it's still really ongoing work. So instead of showing plots, I'll just end by sharing a few sort of key driver takeaways from those analyses. The first one being that, as you might suspect, if you have nets that are more durable and therefore also retained for more time, they could potentially have a substantial impact on ITN effectiveness at preventing malaria transmission and reducing burden overall. But crucially, both of these factors really matter. So both that nets are retained for longer, but also that they are more effective at staying retaining their structural integrity and blocking mosquitoes. Those both really matter in terms of seeing this heightened effect of nets. And so at the moment, we're doing some modeling to explore cost effectiveness and also to compare this question of a more durable net to other strategies that I know folks are considering, such as more frequent distributions or addressing some of these other gaps that we've described. So to conclude, I did want to acknowledge that this question of net use, which is this one small word, really reflects this incredibly complex political, logistical, and cultural landscape about how we get nets into homes, how people choose to use them, and how they choose to discard them. That is really varied across different locales and locations. And having said that, though, it does appear that overall having access to a net is a higher barrier to really effective net coverage than choosing to use a net that you have access to. And that there are challenges really both in the distribution and on the retention of this work. And finally, usually when I'm giving this talk to other folks in my field, I say policymakers are really exploring this question. And I'm so excited to be here because you all are the policymakers, and I would be so thrilled to hear what solutions you're considering to these problems or what other considerations there are that I have neglected to mention in this session. So with that, I'll close and I'll thank my colleagues both at the Institute for Disease Modeling and at the Malaria Atlas Project, which is really the sort of core center for this work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amelia, for this wonderful presentation and for staying within time for us. Thank you so much. Once again, I would like to remind you to put any question that you have in the chat. And also, if maybe you have the opportunity, you can raise your hand at the discussion session. The next presentation, I'll invite Hannah Anakunka from TropHelp to give us a presentation on ITN durability, implications for ITN access. Hannah, over to you.
Great. Hi, everybody. It is great to be here today with you. It's sad we can't be in person yet, but it's really wonderful to see everybody's names in the participants list and to have a chance to talk to you again about my favorite topic, ITN durability and implications for ITN access. So Amelia's presentation was a really great introduction, obviously, to the overall topic here. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about what happens in the future, since she's shown you sort of the retrospective analysis of that modeling to show the effects of those retention times on ITN access. Clicking, there we go. Okay. So, as you have seen from her paper, I'm looking at this analysis and borrowing a lot of things from her paper. So the first is the retention times that she showed us a little bit earlier. And there's a table in the supplemental materials of her paper that includes the specific data for the retention times for each of those countries. And what we're going to, try to explore in the thing that I'm working on is the implications of these retention times for future ITN access. So specifically in the context of the different ITN distribution strategies that countries have, mass campaigns, the way that we're currently doing them or trying to do them every 3 years with distribution to pregnant women and infants in each year. And what that means in terms of the retention times and the number of ITNs that might be needed, given the variation in the retention times across countries. Another question that comes up as we're exploring this is what is the target level of ITN access that we're aiming for? Different donors and different countries have set different targets, anywhere from 80%, 85, 100%. And I want us to really consider concretely whether these targets are achievable in the context of the retention times that we're experiencing in different places. And if they're not, then we need to think about what comes next. So revisiting the 2010 question that Albert Killian covered in his seminal paper, how many nets are needed for universal coverage, we have been quantifying mass campaigns using population divided by 1.8 now for over a decade. And given what we now know about net retention, net durability, and the variation across countries, is this quantifier still appropriate in all settings? Assuming that we do know what the population is, which is a completely important but also separate question. So we also remain, I think, confused and befuddled and frustrated perhaps by the process of trying to quantify nets for continuous distribution, especially through these newer channels such as school or communities. Is there a way? It would be nice and easy to have a way to develop a population times X% or population divided by something type of quantifier that would help us achieve the levels of ITN access that we want for a continuous strategy. And so this analysis is also trying to get at that question. Can we develop recommendations for a simple arithmetic based quantifier that will allow countries to use an Excel document, list down their population for each of their districts, and then multiply it by a number that will help them get the right number of nets to that place. So we're trying to make it easy, and we'll see if we can do that. So the work that I'm doing at the moment focuses on projecting ITN access for 5 different ITN distribution scenarios. Scenario 1 is the status quo, where we have 3-year mass campaigns using population divided by 1.8. And we're going to vary the amount of routine distribution that occurs from a quantifier using population times 5% to population times 8 times 7%. And the maximum you can actually achieve with routine is around population times 8%, just because of the proportion of people that are pregnant in any given year and the proportion of the population that is a child under 1. Scenario 2 is a full-scale continuous distribution strategy, such as Tanzania has been using for a number of years. In this model, we're going to do a universal coverage campaign at the beginning to scale up coverage, and then maintain ITN distribution at varying levels within these scenarios, varying that quantity of nets that's going in every year using population times 1% all the way up to population times 20 or 20%. Scenario 3 is similar to what Ghana has been doing, again, for a number of years, which is mass campaigns plus continuous distribution between campaigns. So here we keep the mass campaign and the routine again, and we vary what's going on in between those mass campaign years by putting in fewer or more nets. And then I also wanted to look at universal coverage campaigns. So what happens if we conduct 3-year campaigns, but we vary, instead of varying any school or community distribution, we vary that population divided by quantifier between 1.0 and 2.0. And what does that give us in terms of access? And then finally, the same thing, but for 2-year campaigns. So varying again that population divided by number between 1.0 and 2.0. So what we end up is 5 times 20 times 35 countries worth of graphs, which I'm not going to show you. But I have tried to put that together for you here a little bit. Let me just maybe quickly detail out how this model works. And many thanks to Amelia for her assistance in several areas of this, including borrowing her code directly from GitHub. So many of you are familiar with the S-shaped curves that we've used to describe the way that nets are decaying over time. They sort of start out a little bit slowly and then accelerate through the middle here as they are worn out and discarded, and then slow down. So this just illustrates where Tanzania, as one example, falls with the retention time from Amelia's paper, right at 2.15 years of median or retention or median lifespan. And we use this decay rate to inform to determine the net crop in any given year. So again, this is just an example from a district in Kagera region in Tanzania. The nets that have gone in each year are described in this green line, and then the net crop resulting from those distributions, and with the decay rate applied is these blue bars. So you can see the under 5 campaign here, first universal coverage campaign here, and then their 2015, 2016 mass campaign here. After each mass campaign, the net crop decays a little bit, and then additional distributions are building that back up. So we can use that to predict net access or ITN access, as Amelia has described. And you see that here in the orange line, where we can sort of follow along based on the transformation between nets per capita and ITN access. We can predict ITN access as a result of all of these nets going into these this population as it grows each year. So, oh dear. That's interesting. So I have borrowed Amelia's map of African countries to present the results in, but the results are not showing. So that's fine. You might imagine here for 3-year mass campaigns, just using population divided by 1.8, or maybe it is showing on your screen, I'm not sure. But what you would see here, if you could see it, would be lines going up for Liberia as one example, and then quite far down again before the next campaign, and then up and down and up and down. So our typical peaks and troughs cycle for mass campaigns using population times 1.8. Okay, So same thing for the continuous distribution graph. We have no results, but you would see again, for Liberia, you would see something going up a little ways and then holding steady across the years because the continuous distribution maintains ITN access at a more steady rate. Okay, so one question that I wanted to pose to the group here is, what is the target level of ITN access that you want to maintain or think you could maintain? If you're thinking about a mass campaign scenario, what is the minimum level of ITN access that you would want to allow between campaigns? And I would invite folks to type your answer into the chat box, either thinking about countries that you support, countries where you're working, countries where you are in the NMCP. Really interested to hear what you feel you're aiming for in terms of ITN access. So go ahead and type in there if you want. And I will continue onward to the next slide, which does have data in it, so that's great. So what we've done with the results of the modeling or the projected ITN access is to try and determine what the quantifier, so population times X% for continuous distribution channels should be in order to sustain ITN access at different levels of target. So here we're showing for scenario 2, which is the full continuous distribution strategy, what would it take? What would the quantifier be if you want to maintain access at 70%? What would it require if you want to maintain your access at a minimum of 80%? And what would it require if you wanted to maintain ITN access at a minimum of 90% so that you could actually hit 80% ITN use? Same thing for scenario 3, which is the continuous distribution between mass campaigns. If the minimum access that you want to allow is 70%, if you're Burkina Faso, as one example, you would want to use population times 11% to quantify the nets needed for those years in between campaigns, in addition to what you're doing for routine distribution. So again, maybe just for Nigeria, I'll take you through a bit step by step. So if Nigeria, in this case, based on their retention time, wants to maintain 70% ITN access at a minimum, they would need to use an annual, and they were doing an annual community distribution nationwide, for example. They would want to use population times 12% to procure nets every year and distribute them in order to maintain a minimum of 70% ITN access. If they set their target at 80%, they would want to quantify that annual amount of nets at population times 18%. And if they want to maintain ITN access at 90%, they would want to quantify their annual amount of nets using population times 27%. So great, I'm seeing a lot of targets in the chat and a comment that this needs a lot of regular funding. Indeed, it does, my friends. So this is a lot more nets. Sorry, just click through here. A lot more nets than we have been distributing thus far. And the other element of this that I wanted to show you is for the 3-year campaign cycle. When we're using population divided by 1.8, what does that mean for the sort of the bottom of the trough in between campaigns? And so I'm highlighting here in sort of red for less good and green for more towards 80%. The lowest level of ITN access that's reached in those troughs between campaigns. So for countries with a short retention time like Angola or Benin, that trough is down around 20%. For countries with a longer retention time, Cameroon and Eritrea, Congo, that trough is actually going to be much higher and possibly near where we actually would want to maintain our ITN access. So retention time obviously has a huge impact on how far down we go in that trough before the next campaign. And I wanted to highlight that here. So Something else that we're looking at is the feasibility of large-scale school distribution in different countries. So if you're Nigeria and you're thinking about maybe school distribution, but you know that you need to reach 18%, population times 18% in order for your strategy to achieve 80% ITN access, minimum 80% ITN access. Do you actually have a population of school-going children that's large enough to meet that requirement of 18%? So the map on the left here, map A, describes the countries in green where that primary school-going population is large enough to allow school distribution to achieve targets of, in this case, 70% ITN access in a full-scale school or community type of distribution. And map B is a target of 80% ITN access. So in the orange countries, that school-going population, based on their most recent DHS, isn't quite big enough to provide enough people for the nets to go out into the population and to achieve that target, assuming that you're only giving one net per pupil. So if you have decided to maybe give more than one net per pupil, you could perhaps still make this, this channel work. Great. So you may be asking, Hannah, isn't this orders of magnitude more nets than we are currently procuring? And yes, the answer is yes, it is. Because of the ways that ITN access is less efficient at those higher rates, it does require more ITNs than we have currently been procuring to achieve the targets that we have typically been setting for ourselves. And I think it's important to just recognize that and sit with it for a bit and not expect a net to do more than it's able to do in the environment and the realities on the ground than we can expect it to. So, but how many more nets is it? Here's I have two examples and then I'll close. For Tanzania, as one example, when we compare the different strategies that countries may want to use. So in orange here is the 3-year universal coverage with routine nets needed for 2022 to 2030. So that's an 8-year period. The green is a mass campaign with school distribution between campaigns. And blue is I think a target of 80 or 90%, sorry, 90% minimum full-scale school distribution. So those two require a lot of nets. This is sort of the status quo here in orange. The purple bar, though, is a school distribution scenario with a slightly lower target of 80%, and it actually requires fewer nets than the mass campaign strategy while maintaining ITN access consistently higher. And we've spoken about this in a number of other papers, but we're trying to illustrate it here in a slightly different manner. And while you can also do 5-year mass campaigns, which actually has been the historical cycle of the Tanzania distributions just because of delays, that will require fewer nets, excuse me, but also will have a resulting impact on the amount of ITN access that you can achieve in the population. And Zanzibar is down here, which has the same relationship, but obviously smaller numbers of nets because of smaller population. So then finally, in terms of what this might mean at different target levels and the percentage of net difference in what's needed for countries with a shorter retention time versus countries with a longer retention time, I've got three illustrative countries here: Liberia with a very short retention time, just over 1 year; Nigeria with a kind of average or maybe slightly above average retention time of 2.2 years; and then Mali with a nice, almost what we want retention time of under 3 years, 2.81 years. So we're looking at the blue bars here are the different full-scale continuous distribution strategies with different percentage targets. And the green are the campaign strategies, and then the gray is the combination of mass campaigns with continuous distribution. Let's start with Mali at almost 3 years. So this is the percent difference compared to 3-year mass campaigns using population divided by 1.8. So a full-scale continuous distribution strategy targeting using a target of 70% would require 30% fewer nets than the current mass campaign strategy. A CD strategy with a target of 80% would require 18% fewer nets over 15 years compared to a 3-year mass campaign strategy using population divided by 1.8, and would provide better coverage. If you are targeting 90% with continuous distribution, that is going to require about 16% more nets than the 3-year campaign strategy here. But then you're maintaining consistently 90% coverage. And then we can do the same thing for the campaign strategies. So at 70% targets, you need slightly more nets than you're currently putting out in Nigeria and in Mali. In Liberia, you need almost twice as many nets to achieve 70%, a minimum of 70% ITN access between campaigns. And this is because of the very short retention time. One thing that we want to emphasize here is that obviously with higher targets, more nets are needed. It's a greater amount of nets than to get from say 80 to 90% than it requires to move your target from 50 to 60% because of those inefficiencies in the allocation at those higher levels of access. And in Liberia, or in countries with a 1-year net lifespan, you would essentially need a campaign every 2 years, giving 1 net per person to be able to maintain ITN access above 80%. And I'm not saying that the world is prepared to do this, but I think it's important to recognize that that's the kind of limitation that we're talking about when we're trying to hit targets in countries with a short retention time. So in conclusion, I guess I'll wrap up. Maintaining ITN access at 80% with continuous distribution would provide better coverage and require fewer nets than what we're doing currently with 3-year campaigns using population divided by 1.8. And maintaining ITN access at 90%, if we should choose to seriously go for that, would require fewer nets using a continuous strategy versus a campaign-based strategy that had the same target. So there we can compare maybe this dark blue bar with the dark green bar. In Nigeria, they're somewhat close. In Mali, they're quite different. So maintaining 90% under continuous distribution in Mali is more feasible than under a mass campaign approach. I will leave that there with you and look forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you very much. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you to all the presenters once again. So we are the discussion session, and I would like to invite all the presenters to turn on their video as we ask the questions. We have some questions in the chat already, so we will start with those questions. After that, if you have any question, you may please raise your hand. The first question is from Miko to Amelia. Your presentation seems to focus on more durable nets versus actions that can be taken in country. As we are not seeing more durable nets deployed in the field, is it a big assumption that behavior in households won't lead to nets wearing out quickly, regardless of how durable they are supposed to be? I seem to have read that behavior in ITN care and maintenance is the driving factor for net durability. Amelia, over to you.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. Thank you. And I cannot pretend to be an expert on that specific question, but I can point you to other resources and papers that have. Specifically, the Nonwoven Research Institute has been doing really fascinating work on net durability and developing sort of standards for potentially a more durable net. And the papers that they found, which I'll post, A.V. Weldrake and Malaria Journal are going to be the main keywords to search for that. Among other things, they did this incredible forensic analysis of nets that had been in households for several years to understand how nets were damaged. While there is some damage that is sort of really household based and that is not really able to be controlled by a more durable net, so things like nets being burned or being destroyed by rodents, one of the interesting things that they found is that the majority of tears in nets seemed to be through things like snagging and seam failures and these other points that of course come from the way that nets are handled in households, but that also you could imagine creating a net more durably in terms of how you are actually generating the textile to try to address. So that is sort of the question, is in the same way that we can make a more durable car to help prevent some human error, can we make a more durable net to try to do the same thing? Thanks.
Thank you, Amelia. So the next question is also to both Amelia and Hannah, and it's from Tom McLean. The question is whether we have any evidence that land attrition rates have changed over time.
So I'm not aware of anything specific that could lead us to say that. I mean, we've only been monitoring the durability of nets for the last 8 to 10 years, a little bit longer, but that's sort of the beginning of the studies, the initial studies. So over that amount of time, I'm not sure that we have enough data to say that. Maybe Amelia, you have some thoughts on changes in those rates over time.
Nope, I have a fairly similar answer of because of the relative scarcity of these national survey data points, it would be really difficult for us to say with any certainty.
Thank you.
Okay, great.
I'm just an invite to the rest of the audience. If we have on occasions heard it said by people that nets don't last as long as they used to, but I've never seen any actual hard evidence about this. So I would be very interested to understand whether anybody has any clear evidence about that in order to guide what we do about trying to make nets more durable, because it clearly is a very important path forward.
All right, thank you very much. So if anybody have any information, you may please put it in the chat. But for the meantime, I want to go to the next question from Dukani to Hannah. Does it mean that we leave the campaign distribution and focus on the routine one? If it's not clear, maybe Dukani can come in and ask.
Yeah, no, I think I get the nature of the question. So I'm always hesitant to say, oh, this means everybody should switch to continuous distribution because it's fewer nets. I think countries need to make those types of decisions themselves. There's a lot of resources that can be used in terms of the CD toolkit on the AMP website to help look at the operational feasibility of these different channels. It is hard to switch strategies, right? When you've been doing mass campaigns for a long time, you have a way of doing that. You have expectations about how that's planned and how that's budgeted. Donors and partners have expectations. Politicians have expectations. It's hard to start something new and unknown that, even though it may seem like a more efficient or more consistent and maybe better option. So we recognize that there are barriers to adoption for larger scale continuous distribution. I think we're trying to gather that evidence and continue to gather the evidence to show where it does work, where it might be most helpful, where it might be more or less feasible, so that countries don't have a bad experience with trying to test out these new channels and they can make them successful. So I would like to refer everybody to the CD toolkit portion of the AMP website for a lot more information on things that you might need to consider as you plan these channels. But as we're looking for ways to be more efficient with funds, ways to reach more people at the right time with the nets that they need based on the schedule that they need them and not the schedule that we think they need them, I think it's important to consider different options than we've been doing in the past, because we're clearly seeing that stagnation in the gains in ITN access that Marcy and Mary showed earlier, and something needs to change.
Great, thanks for that response. The next question is again to Anna, and that is from Rafael. So Rafael question is on data on how much do more durable net increases net retention across all countries would take years and years to generate and analyze. Given the net access figures today and the average net retention time across countries today, what are we waiting for to reduce the 3-year cycle for mass campaigns?
Yeah, so I might throw that one back to folks maybe from the Global Fund or WHO or PMI. I think clearly there's budget constraints that everybody's facing across the board for malaria. That's certainly a big one. But yeah, maybe I'll invite other folks to chime in on that question.
I might jump in here because I'm going to cover this on day 3. But I think, beyond we want to get more nets out, national programs have an entire plethora of activities to implement. ITNs are not the only thing they need to do. So doing more frequent campaigns, you basically need an army of national malaria program staff that do nothing but ITN campaigns. And that's not the reality in most countries. And so I think more frequent campaigns are not the solution. I think we need to look to continuous distribution and we need to invest in it. I think it's nice that we as partners want to do something, but I think we need to listen to the programs and understand the workload we're trying to put on them. So that's just from my perspective. I will definitely hit on that on day 3. Over.
Great, thank you, Marcy. Maybe any other person from PMI or Global Fund either to respond?
Thanks, everyone. This is Lilia with PMI, and noting that Marcy, as she flagged, will talk about this more later, but I agree with her points. Is as Hannah noted, there are, there's a fixed envelope for funding, and within that, different programs and partners need to prioritize how to reach their goals. And also, I think exactly as Marcy said, it's not just the funding, it's also the time and the human resources needed to execute. I think we're all quite familiar about the challenge. And so how to maintain coverage in a way that's balancing all of those needs, I think is critical. But look forward to discussing further later. And I think the other point that's really important for us to think about is the environmental impact of putting all this plastic out. And I think that that's another point that we can discuss further. But what happens, at the end of useful life of these nets and where they're used. And so I think really looking at improving the durability and thus improving the retention is quite important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lilia, and also for Susie for the message in the chat. So I'll move to the next question, which is to Amelia from Jess. So for countries that are experiencing insecurity, how well does the data collected through the large surveys represent the targeted area? And if only accessible areas are included in the survey data, how are the modeling outputs adjusted for this?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. And I would largely point to a paper that was recently put out by my colleagues at Northwestern, so Jolene Girardin and Ifeoma Ozodiegwu, really looking at DHS surveys and their representativeness using Nigeria as an example. And the short answer to that is that there are challenges in terms of those data collection questions. DHS and other related surveys are truly incredible programs, but it's hard to collect data in places where it's risky to do so. And so that is what we take largely as a limitation of the survey and something that is incorporated in the uncertainty estimates around different spatial disaggregations, but is not something that we otherwise are able to explicitly correct for. I also wanted to quickly add a brief note to the earlier really excellent question about sort of this question about net durability versus increased campaigns, just to note that our hope is that in the next few months, we'll be able to, on our side, put out some modeling work trying to answer that question, because we have a transmission model that can sort of assess net burden in simulation settings under different landscapes. And then really connecting that to this question of how cheap would a more durable net need to be in order to make that a cost-effective solution compared to more frequent campaigns, taking into account in particular the cost of not just the nets for a campaign, but also the campaigns itself, as folks are describing. So thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is also to Hannah. Would you have different levels of coverage targeted for different goals? Basic coverage 60%, then as malaria drops higher and higher, the near-end countries could go closer to 100% to hit elimination. This is from Drake. If the question doesn't come out clear, please, you may please ask here. Is that okay,
Yeah,
Hannah?
I think so. So the question's
Okay.
about whether a different sort of transmission setting might need a different target level or use a different target level in order to achieve the goals. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question that I haven't seen a lot of work on yet, or maybe I'm just missing it. I think given the challenges that we have in reaching the targets, the high targets that are sort of the de facto targets that we've set, I do have lots of questions about what is the right target to set based on what we can achieve at that target level. So we have achieved a lot with ITN access over the last 10 years, 15 years at these lower levels that we are hitting. To what extent do we need to raise those targets and put all these more nets out in order to reach the goals that we've set for ourselves? Does that vary according to the transmission setting? I think that's a really interesting question, and I hope somebody's working on it because I'm not. But I don't know, maybe Amelia, you've heard other people or Mary or others in the room thinking about that question.
Mary, do you want to add up to that, or is it okay?
No, I think it's okay. I mean, I think we're all aware of the stratification exercises that are underway. That doesn't directly answer that specific question, but I think that, you know, WHO is leading those efforts, and you know, many countries are undertaking stratification and intervention prioritization and mapping efforts, and we're seeing more and more of those in Global Fund applications and others that are coming through. So it is being applied, but then also with the related operational challenges that then come with implementing a much more complex array of interventions. So as Marcy said, now countries are not just implementing one campaign, they're implementing many different types of interventions in different areas, and communication and other challenges, as well as the logistics one. So I think it's again placing much more burden on the countries to implement more complex solutions. Over.
Great, thank you once again. So the last question I have in the chat for now is from Jenny. So the question is trying to understand the use of terminology continuous distribution for school-based distribution, which is usually a one of like a mass campaign. In the same vein, the community-based distribution, is that a one-off distribution or is a continuous distribution? And if it is that not the same as a mass campaign, would the community approach be a drip net on demand approach? Also, we need to factor in that routine ANC and EPR distribution is still often far from optimal in reaching the majority of pregnant women and young children. Jenny, I'm not sure if I've asked your question right, but maybe Hannah, if you got it, you may respond to it.
Yeah, no, thanks, Janie, for that question and the opportunity to clarify the terms that I did not define in my presentation. So yeah, I mean, as we've been talking about for a number of years, we use continuous distribution as a broad term to include any type of distribution that's typically not a mass campaign. So annual school distributions, yes, they are annual. They are, you know, they take place over a few days in a given location. But the fact they are planned to be done annually makes them continuous in a way that mass campaigns are you know, maybe less. But you know, we can debate punctuality of events. Continuous community distribution is not a community campaign, in my view. That's a campaign. But community distribution, as it's been piloted and scaled up in a number of countries, generally does want to make nets available at any given time for any person that needs them in an on-demand approach, using generally a coupon system to help I guess, slow down the rate of uptake of those nets and to ensure equity among different populations, or prioritizing of different population segments. So the idea of community distribution is, I guess, more continuous. It's on a day-to-day basis. People should be able to obtain a net through that system when they need one. But no, I wouldn't call community distribution a mass campaign. And then I think for the question on routine, yes, clearly there is a need to make sure that those routine channels targeting pregnant women and infants are working well. Those populations are vulnerable and they are important, but that is not, that channel, or those channels, if you want to think of them as two, ANC and EPI, don't contribute a lot to the overall level of ITN access. So improving them beyond where they are right now is not going to have a big impact on the total access that a country is able to achieve. But obviously improving them means that the most vulnerable groups would be better protected, and that would have a big impact on malaria burden in those groups. Over.
Thank you very much. And I think we are almost at the session or the time for a break, but maybe I'll ask one last question that came from Xander to both Hannah and Amelia. Shouldn't we start thinking on finding a way to provide more technical and strong continuous support on CD between the 3 years mass campaigns? Both to Amelia and Hannah.
Yeah, and maybe Mary, I'll call you in here too. Yes, I think there are a few countries that have done a lot of continuous distribution, and there are others that have not piloted them, or a pilot was done a while ago, and maybe the people who did that are no longer in country to advise, or busy with other things, and that's okay. So yes, I would say it is important for the TA providers to be conversant and able and up to speed to provide TA on continuous distribution, to provide advice for whatever stage countries are in their thinking. Yeah, Marcy or Mary and others, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah and Robert, and thanks, Xander, for the question. I mean, absolutely. I think, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're having the conversation today, and why we're working on the tracker, so that we can start to get a baseline for where countries are. And there are many countries who have been working on continuous distribution and been making those transitions and have learning. So as Hannah mentioned, the CD.org website has many of those resources documented. We're continuing to document, but much more work needs to be done. And I think if we think about our trajectory since 2002, 2004, as we were moving away from more continuous types of distribution that we naturally started with before the amazing innovations of the campaigns, which helped us get to where we are now with much higher coverage levels. In making those transitions, it really did take a targeted focus and the support of the AMP in terms of helping us focus on those questions and focus on the support that's needed for countries. But definitely with a few countries that I've spoken with who want to make that move, there is a nervousness about what's involved with that, how complicated it is. And in many cases, they are doing it a little bit alone, but still facing quite difficult questions from their ministries of health, who still want to see successes of those channels. So I think I think the question really also is for national malaria programs and the support that would best help them. Over.
Great. Thank you very much, Hannah, to Amelia, and also to Mary for this wonderful session and for the discussions. We will just take a short break, but I'll hand over to Debbie for a quick announcement. For our next set of presentations, it will basically focus on digitalization. And for the first person to do the presentation for this session, we have Karen Gatton from the Gavi, who is the focal person for digital health information. Karen, sorry.
Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to join you. Can you confirm you hear me?
Yes, we can, Corinne. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to switch on to French to change a bit, but I wanted to say greeting to everyone in English and say that the slides will be shared in English and in French. Bonjour à tous, je suis Karine et je suis ravie de présenter
Hello everyone, I'm Karine and I will be doing my presentation in English. I was invited to give you a presentation on our priorities in the health sector. It's a bit broader than just regarding malaria, but I hope it will be a good introduction to talk about vaccination against malaria. I work for the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. I work on the digital health information, and I will start my presentation now. My presentation is in English, and you can also have access to the presentation in French later. I will talk to you about Gavi's digital health information priorities, and then I will focus on what we are doing during immunization campaigns to be able to have this real-time monitoring of the campaign. So we just started to implement our strategies on the digital health information and on our 6 priorities. You will see that one of our priorities is to focus on vaccination. And it is definitely something that can be implemented in the framework of the malaria vaccine campaigns. And these techniques are techniques that you can implement in your own vaccination campaign, whether being for malaria or something else. Our first priority is regarding the identification and the reach of 0-dose and under-immunized children, meaning children that have only part of the vaccine or no vaccine at all. We're using several methods using geospatial data, and we are really trying to reach the communities that are not, that are missing, that are in this gap. We are trying to do this through our health services. So we are using digital micro planning, for example. And as you can see on the presentation, we use many different dashboards that includes population data. For the vaccination programs, they have their own dashboards, but we also have other sources of information. And sometimes we have sources coming from the government or other NGOs. I won't go into details now, but because we have just a short time, but the WHO will also present their work on this. Beyond the dashboards, we are also using a lot what we call the lists coming from the different health centers, health infrastructures. We also promote what we call the smart maps, well, the intelligence subnational maps. So we will be overlapping these datas. For example, the scope of the area, what centers can provide the vaccination, what infrastructures can be used for the distribution of nets,
the traveling times, the access by transports, where are located the households, which households are concerned, and how to reach households that are in a long distance to living far from these health centers. So we also use the tool of satellite identification of settlement and communities. So we make sure that no communities fall into this gap and this gray zone. Our second priority, which is also, I guess, very important for you, is the effective use of subnational data. We really try to make this subnational data available at a district level. In the vaccination campaigns, we really struggled to have this information disseminated to every level. It's really regarded to operational logistics levels. So now we are working to disseminate this information to the different districts so that they do have access to this data and they are ready for their intervention on their ground. Also, so that they are able to use the micro-planning, but also use the right tools and right dashboards for the monitoring of the campaign. And we don't want to have data to create a report and to have a list, to know how many nets were distributed, but we also want to have this data to have a wider overview. How much money do we have to distribute the nets? How many vehicles we have to distribute the nets? How many people are operating on the ground? So we are really focusing on this logistic and operational data that before were not valued enough regarding what they could actually bring us and how useful they could be for the authorities. So we want to disseminate this information, but not only, we also want to facilitate the decision-making process. So we have various tools that allows us to create algorithms to take decisions more easily. Our third priority that can be interesting for you is regarding the supply chain, all the information surrounding the supply chain. This is something crucial in vaccination campaigns. And here we really want to focus on how to use digital tools to have a better visibility of the stock availables, so that we're sure that at least once a month, the stock in the health center are known and that we can know how to react according on a district level according to the situation. So this is the minimum action we want to reach with this priority. And I think it's very important to do as much as we can so that this system is available to every level for the stock logistics every part of the supply chain, really. And the other priority that I wanted to mention here is all the digital interventions that help supporting and responding to the demand and help increasing the confidence in the vaccine. So I think it's quite the same for intervention regarding vaccines for malaria. How can we use social media? How can we use internet and all these digital tools to increase the confidence in the vaccine? Because very often there is some mistrust regarding the quality or the use of nets or vaccine. And we want to really see how we can influence people's behavior regarding this prevention technique. And there is also the point of how can we use these digital tools to trace the people who lost confidence in the products. And this can be interesting for the nets, for example, or for children following seasonal treatments. And then we have this priority that's probably the most interesting one for you, is the real-time planning and monitoring of immunization campaigns. So here we start to at least have some good experience with these digital technologies and mobile technologies during immunization campaigns, because it showed that it really helped to improve timely reporting, coordination, the monitoring, and the follow-up post-campaign. So this is also something that's really important here. These digital tools can help before, during, and after the campaign. Here, when you will have the presentation, you will be able to click on the picture and will bring you to the website. UNICEF also wanted to do a campaign of net distribution, and they reached out to us to know what we learned about these digital tools that could be supporting campaigns. So there was a first report that we published in 2021, and we did exhaustive case studies in 4 countries, in Pakistan, Indonesia, Uganda, and Zambia, where different tools were used. And through this study, we saw that these digital tools helped to improve the planification, the follow-up, the coordination, and that these tools were helping to improve the overall outcome of the immunization campaign. The services were also improved too. There was a better access for the different communities to this immunization campaign when we were using digital tools to disseminate the information about the campaign. And for example, when we were sending funds for the campaign, we are using many different digital tools like mobile money or other platforms. And this really improved the collaboration and every partnerships that we had. This really improved the campaigns overall. We also completed our case studies because after we published this first handbook, we did 2 other case studies, one in Bangladesh. In a few days, Bangladesh immunized 35 million children, and it was a fully digitalized campaign. They were using the DHIS2. They also brought a lot of innovation that we didn't see before. They had an online micro-planning of vaccination campaign. They also did a daily vaccine and logistic requirement, how many vaccines were needed. They were able to deliver to move from a region to another, the quantity of vaccines if needed. They were doing this daily reporting, and they coordinating all the visits, all the household visits, all the session supervisions through the DHIS2. So of course, besides innovations, there are also challenges because these new technologies can take some time people need some time to get used to it, to know how to master them. And more staff is also needed to deal with all this amount of data. There was a true success after this case study in Bangladesh, because every level was committed in this campaign. And the fact that every level, district, national level, were committed, resulted in a great success. And Bangladesh shows that thanks to this strategy, the coverage was completely 100%. The second case study is the case study of Rwanda. What is interesting is to see how the country used during the pandemic strategy for the rollout of the vaccines. Everything is digitalized in Rwanda, so they used different digital tools, always relying on national resources, whether being websites, the internet, operators, experts. Everything was done online, really. So they set up a tracker on the COVID-19 vaccination campaign. And you can see here the figures. It was more than 15 million vaccination events, more than 500 vaccination sites. Everything was digitalized. There was no paper at all. For the surveillance part, it was also very interesting regarding the cases of COVID-19. And here, again, all the testing sites were using digital tools. Everything is sent to the lab test. Everything is digitalized too. And before it took a week, up to a week, more than a week, and now the results are available in 48 hours or even less. And we received the results of the test through digital mode. You can also, once you have the presentation, you can also click on the picture on the right and access the website to read the full report of the case study. So with all this information, we really wanted to show and share with you our guide, our handbook on how to plan and implement a real-time monitoring system to strengthen vaccination campaign delivery. And I think that these techniques, these digital strategies can be something that you could use in the framework of malaria vaccination campaigns. And I will also add that within the Gavi and with the UNICEF and WHO, we do not impose which digital tool to use. We do only suggestions and recommendations. And once you click on the report, you will see all the examples mentioned. And beyond the interventions, of course, funding is needed. And they are also always with this environmental scope. So is there a private sector engagement? Is there capacity building? Are civil society organizations involved in this strategy? So that's all I wanted to say. And I will be available to answer 2 questions just after the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a very wonderful presentation, and for letting us know what tools are available for immunization that the malaria community can learn from. So the next set of presentation will be from the WHO team from WHO GIS Center for Health. And we have 3 team members who are making this presentation. Chris John, who is the emergency specialist with the GIS working group for COVAX. We have Ravi Shankar, who is the GIS Technical Officer, and Daniel Obari, who is the GIS Consultant. Please, you are reminded to put your questions in the chat. After this presentation, we will have a discussion. Also, interpretation is available. So if you haven't seen it, please go to the interpretation button. Over. Christian, over to you. All right.
Thanks, Robert. And it was an excellent presentation from Karine. We worked closely with Gavi on many things, and it's very nice to hear from her here. We are going to talk on a slightly different aspect on digital microplan. How do we improve the population estimates and also to make sure equal accessibility and the campaign outcomes, or improved campaign outcomes? That's what we are going to talk about. But before going to that, let me just talk about us, ourselves a little bit. Next slide, please, Chris, is about the WHO GIS Center for Health. So what is WHO GIS Center for Health? Is an entity which was established in August 2020 to support various programs within WHO and also to the member states. So we did have a strategy with three main objectives: to support on tools and technology, technical exchange and partnership, technical support and capacity development. These are the three things which we are handling. And we are very happy to be part of this initiative here. Next slide, please, Chris, and please take over there.
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. My name is Chris Jung. I work on Ravi's team with the GIS Center for Health, and I'm based in Kigali, Rwanda. One of my main responsibilities is on this GIS working group that the GIS Center is participating in. It's UNICEF and WHO led, with Karine is actually the representative from Gavi on that side, as well as participants from, we have the Global Fund, World Bank, CDC, Gates Foundation, and others on the steering side. And here we have a list of the technical partners that have been participating over the last year plus. There's probably a few more as well. So you can get a sense of all the different participants, the different expertise that's been brought to bear in various countries around Africa, Asia, and beyond, some Pacific Island nations and others. And the purpose of the working group really is to, we originally started with COVAX and microplanning for the vaccines for COVID-19, but it's expanded into microplanning in general for health and even some GIS support beyond that. So really working towards getting GIS microplanning as something that countries can use as a tool today, and moving it away from that sort of theoretical pilot, something from the future, to realizing that these tools are ready to be brought to bear now, and these are something that can improve campaigns today. So a quick outline of what we're going to talk about today. We'll go into what is geo-enabled microplanning with some examples from the past. Then we'll talk about an ongoing pilot in Burundi for a malaria ITN campaign. And then at the end, just a few minutes about a geo-enabled microplanning handbook document that we're supporting and that's soon to be released. So first, a little bit about setting the stage. What is geo-enabled microplanning? With this audience here, I don't think I need to go into too much detail on what microplanning is. Most of you have used microplanning in the traditional sense, paper-based hand-drawn maps for many years, supporting LLIN campaigns and for other uses. The geo-enabled component of this is mostly around supporting and improving that planning using geospatial data and technologies. It's making that service delivery more efficient, more equitable, and making sure that the local levels are all reached. This is sort of a very complete definition here, but the key points to take away from this is that what we want to do is identify those gaps in the population, and especially to ensure the equitable access among all vulnerable populations so that no one's left behind and we don't miss anyone, and so that the campaigns can really reach their full potential. These outreach activities are really about that equitability component and reaching services to that last mile. So all of our geo-enabled microplanning comes down to bringing data into systems to answer these questions. And generally, we start with 5 layers of data here. You can start, I guess, at the bottom with the spatial population, which really is just a representation of where people are. We'll go into that in more detail. Then we can connect that to where the health facilities are, or in, if you're not using facilities for your campaign, whatever distribution points that you've chosen. Looking at travel time to connect those people to those facilities. The satellite imagery can give us the context and the tools to do that analysis and to look at the most recent and current imagery that we have available for that modeling. And connecting those health facilities or distribution points to catchment areas to identify where to send our resources, how to organize our teams, and how to place those plans, overlaying the population in the most effective way. So population estimation is key here. And really what that does is it brings statistical models, and in particular from remote sensing data sets. And we can take that and validate that on the ground and come up with statistical models that show exactly where people are, in what densities and in what distributions. This can be combined with census data and layered together, or if the census data is quite old or not useful in this particular area, it can be used alone. And we're creating more accurate population denominators for identifying the total number of people to be served and where we need to go to reach them. Or in the other sense, where we need to place facilities so that they can reach us. So that connection there of where people are then has to come back to where the services are. And that's really at the crux of this. And that comes down to geographic accessibility modeling. So there's a few types of models that we could create in varying levels of sophistication. One is a strict accessibility. Where can people reach where they need to reach? We take that information and we can use that to model where the most effective placements of service locations are. And then the next level would be even a route optimization to try to help identify the best way to reach people with, say, the chits for collecting a BedNet, or for them to come and reach a facility that we've identified for them. The goal for all of this is to look for gaps, and you can see there's sort of an illustrative example here. If you were to draw a 1 kilometer boundary around your distribution points, how many people are outside of that area? The little red underlays are the building footprints from the area. So you can see the distribution of people. That's one proxy that we can use for population. And you can take that a level deeper with more sophisticated models to come up with actual population locations. You can find those gaps in the service coverage. And you can identify either places to move an existing location or to add an additional service location. And these models can be layered and iterated and tested that way. Many countries would, for a mass campaign, implement something like a criteria. They don't want people to travel more than, say, 3 kilometers to reach a health facility. And this is one way to test that, to see if every person, every building footprint that you have is within that threshold. It's also a way that we can, as we'll show in a little more detail later, we can set up catchment areas for each of these facilities to divide up the population relatively evenly so that each distribution point or facility has a relatively even number of people that they're serving, so that there's not an overburden on one team and an underutilization of another team. I'll pass it back to Ravi here to talk about a concrete example that we've used microplanning for in the past.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to talk an example from polio. We used a similar technique there in the past. Actually, I worked in polio eradication for more than 10 years. So I thought I could show one example of how the population modeling can be very helpful. There are two ways you can do a population modeling, because as Chris said, that it's a methodology. It's a statistical method, right? One way is we call it a top-down approach. You take the total population of a state or a province or a district, and you have the footprints where you know people live, and you add other criteria to distribute it downwards. But there's a reverse way where you can go bottom up. So you have sampling at the bottom level to understand how many people are living at every household, and then you identify the type of buildings or the patterns of buildings based on the land use and land type. Then you start associating population based on that. And then if you add them up, you come to the province level or the district level to understand how many people live. So there are two methods of way you can actually do the population calculation. And both has its advantage and disadvantage. If you want to do for a big country and you don't have good sample data on the bottom, you start from top and go down. And of course, some places, you know, the census have been done long years ago. So you do a bottom up where you take the samples at that level and you slowly move it up. So I'm going to show an example for Mogadishu in Somalia. We did a similar exercise for polio. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, what is the scope of this work? We actually took one region, and with 16 districts was where we did the pilot test. And we had around 23 polio officers, district polio officers involved in that. The whole scope of this was to cover around 952 or 1,000 teams. So there were 1,000 teams who were going down to the field to vaccinate the children in the house. We had almost like 2,000 vaccinators, and to cover 200,000 children households and almost like 500,000 children. So this was the scope of the study. We took this as an example, and then we went to next level. Chris, can we go to the next slide? So we did like 3 levels of workshop. We did an initial workshop at the district level. So it's like a trainers of trainers. We printed maps to the detail level for every place. So it was like a big satellite imagery map. And then we ran the workshops, and then we started finalizing some details. What did we actually finalize? Can we go to the next slide, please, Chris? What did we actually do is, before going there, and also the reason why actually this technique is important, the digital microplan, the way we are doing using satellite imageries, you can just imagine this Mogadishu between 2016 and 2018 is exactly the same place. You can see how much new housing have come in a span of 3 years. So you have a lot of urban sprawls, you have a lot of people who are just settling outside the major cities or towns. New settlements mushroom up. If you go to the traditional methods, if you do not update them regularly, I think you are going to miss a lot of places. There's going to be a lot of gaps and overlaps in your methods. Next slide, please, Chris. So this is what we did. We brought all of them to a workshop. We used a satellite imagery. We had a printed map. We had a projector and a PowerPoint. So we projected the satellite imagery in the map, and we asked them, what is your boundary of we asked every supervisor, what is your boundary? So they have to identify the 4 boundaries or 4 corners of their area which they are covering. Each supervisor might have like 5 teams or so, and might be 10 supervisors is under one health facilities. So that is the hierarchy. Then what we did is we mapped them, all of them, and we brought them into a digital copy. Then what we did is we used a spatial population through a bottom-up approach. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what we did is we digitized all the buildings there. When we did this, actually, we did a manual work. We did a mapathon. and identified every buildings. And then we sort of associated a population with every structure. When it's an urban area, when it's a neighborhood in the main city, it has more people than which is outside. Then we started seeing interesting patterns. It was just, it started as a simple exercise, but it led into a lot of insights. For example, on the top left, you have like 30,000 buildings covered by one supervisor. Whereas in some area, you have like 1,500 houses covered by the supervisor. Then we started associating population with this to understand more what is exactly actually going on. Why is this disparity? There are few reasons associated with it. One is there's, as I said, urban growth, organic growth, very spiraling growth, which was not taken into account when they're dividing the teams and the supervisor areas. The second one is there's also a lot of influx of IDPs within the country. IDPs are the internal displaced people who had been moving into that, but they're not in a very organized camp. They're just finding all open spaces and they're trying to integrate with the community. So there is a lot of these populations started spreading out, which has actually given a lot of more population. And with this exercise, we actually really was a really good exercise for the country to understand the ground reality. Next slide. Then we went into one more step more to understand where are these additional IDP settlements or IDPs. So we started mapping all of them. Then the outcome of this exercise is to have a separate strategy for IDPs so that that population can be covered by a different strategy other than the normal strategy. Because there's going to be so many people which are very focused, which are also from outside tribe or community who are into this city. So we had a slightly different, the program, the WHO country office program had a different strategy to address that specific problem. This is what actually a digital microplan actually can help us. Next slide, please. Over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thanks, Ravi. So to bring this closer to the purpose of today, we can talk a little bit about an ongoing program in Burundi, which is an LLIN campaign support for digital microplanning as well. I'll set it up and then Daniel can talk about the details of the work there. So this was a Global Fund project, part of the COVID-19 response mechanism that we helped to scope out and apply for funding for some GIS and geo-enablement support last year. That was approved as an addition to the malaria campaign, the mass campaign that's going on in being planned right now. So that campaign will be in June and they're ongoing with the microplanning now. We planned to do a pilot in 2 health districts. One was Bujumbura Muri Zone Sud, which is the south of the largest city, and the neighboring rural district, Kabezi as well. So we got to see both the rural context and the city. We are working closely with the AMP teams and IFRC and others in the country, and there are consultants that have led this exercise. We were in a supporting role, but we can just talk a little bit about that. It's still ongoing. The workshops were last week, and the purpose of it is to develop this capacity in country so that they can carry this forward, to demonstrate the usefulness of this and to build some momentum for adopting these sort of techniques in the country. So Daniel, I can pass it back to you.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Daniel Ubare. I'm a GIS admin working in the GIS Center. Okay, so just to give a brief on the objective of the campaign. The digital microplanning pilot test was to improve the distribution sites for the mosquito net, and the digitizing of the supervisor area and and the team areas. So two districts were identified, as Chris has mentioned. We have Zone Sud and Kabezi. Two teams were attached to these districts, and the teams were comprised of the data manager, the program officer, and the GIS officer. Next slide, please. So during the campaign, Zone Sud had 5 supervisors, whereas Kabezi had 19 supervisors. These supervisors came with their hand-drawn maps, and they marked the boundaries on a map. The GIS officers digitized these marked boundaries and aligned the boundaries to remove gaps and overlaps. As we can see, the objective of the workshop was to digitize the supervisor and the team boundaries. Next slide. So the output of the workshop, as you can see, the boundaries that are marked in green are the supervisor boundaries, and the yellow boundaries are the team boundaries. A 3-kilometer radius buffer was drawn around the distribution sites, which are symbolized in white on the map. And this was to determine the distance, the walking distance to the distribution site. So you could see some areas that are outside the distribution sites, and then this can indicate that the population can walk more than 3 kilometers to the distribution site. So finally, maps for each distribution area will be printed to be used in the field during the campaigns. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Danny. So as I mentioned, this is ongoing work. The team is still on the ground in Bujumbura, working on compiling the results for this workshop. I don't want to steal their thunder. I think they'll have a better report with more details, but I can give some preliminary findings that they've shared with us. And just to let you know for how this has gone. They did get good engagement and participation from the National Malaria Program and Ministry of Health and others. From the participants, they believed that the population estimates that they got through this exercise were more accurate than what they had come up with previously in the paper-based microplanning exercise and the information they had available to them from the census. I believe it had been a very long time since the last census in Burundi. There was interest that came out of the workshop in scaling this nationally. Due to time, probably not for this particular campaign in June, but for other uses for the next campaign and for other health cases and health interventions. And some particular analysis that came out of this, they realized that they needed to add more distribution sites to Zone Sud, not based on the distance, but simply the population to be served by each site. They thought there would be too many people coming to one site. And they were able to confirm, they were worried that people would have to travel too far in Kabezi, but they could confirm that they had enough sites in the right locations that everyone was within 3 kilometers of a facility. Challenges, this was all done online, and they did find that the audience that they brought from the area's responsibility were not very familiar with online maps and using tools such as this. So they thought printing paper maps, using the results of the preparation and the GIS tools, and then printing that out might have been a helpful way to bring people into this incrementally. There was also some disagreement. There were 2 health districts, and the representatives of the 2 districts didn't exactly agree on where the borders of those districts were, and in particular, some facilities that were near the border, should they serve people on the other side. That's something that is illuminated by this process. They felt that they needed a bit more time, or maybe more usefully, a few more facilitators, so that there could be more individual attention in the workshop. Unfortunately, they had good representation from the field teams, the people who'd be doing the campaign, but they did not get the LLIN campaign technical teams to attend these workshops, but they will be sharing the findings in the report with them going forward. So we're a few minutes over. I just want to take 1 minute here and talk about one more thing here. We have a document coming out very soon. We're in the final review for a geo-enabled microplanning handbook. I see many of the names and the participants today have participated in this process of creating this. We've crowdsourced this from a group of experts in digital microplanning. The concept here is to make this a bit of a technical cookbook with a recipe for how to do geo-enabled microplanning. It's targeted towards a technical audience, or for the management, the program design people who would be tasked with managing that technical audience. And we hope to have the first draft completed next week, and then published within a few weeks later. We will be following it up with an online learning course, and with rolling this out in a couple of countries. We're going to follow the implementation of this as it goes out. We hope to try it in several different health contexts, one being COVID vaccination, but another being malaria, and then perhaps some others. And the idea is that this would not be a one and done document, that we would then take that feedback and iterate into this and improve the handbook with some practical information there. And I just want to mention our colleague, Jo Bellinger. I think she's on the call listening in. She's been the driving force on this in recent times. And she's, I think many of you have probably been in contact with her regarding this already. So that's the end of our presentation. I'm going to say thank you, and we're ready for questions.
Thank you very much, Chris, Daniel, and Ravi. At this point, I'll invite Karen to join the team as we go through the questions. So first question is to Karen. Do immunization programs find challenges in countries that implement digital technologies for collecting and analyzing information on campaign progress? And if so, how are they addressed? This is from David.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, David, for the question. Obviously, the answer is yes. There is a lot of challenges, and again, I encourage you to go to those lessons learned document and guidance, because it's really to learn from those challenges that we want everyone to share. So what is happening is, and you know this better than anyone else, the main way to address the challenge is to prevent them and to really plan ahead of time. So there is, in many cases, the major challenge is that the digital people have been brought on board very lately by the program. So it's very difficult, for all the digital technical support to come, once the campaign is already kind of planned, things are done, and then you ask people, hey, please, can you digitalize this? And it's hard. So just bring those people from the day one you start planning the malaria campaign, for example. This is really ask, bring everyone, because I will tell you very quickly, what to plan for the data connectivities, the number of data you need to buy, the devices, all the maintenance of IT. They will tell you everything, but they need to be involved from the beginning. Also, another thing quickly, I'm not going to address all because we have full guidance. And another challenge that is coming quite often during a campaign, it's like in a big emergency, big stress. Do not bring new things. Just use what you have in country. You have tons of digital tools you use already. WhatsApp, ODK, DHIS2, Power BI, things that you have already in country, people used to it. So you just, tailor the way you use them. So there is different way of making sure that you will do the burden of those challenges. All is in planning, trying, testing at small bits, and then after you are ready for the big scale for the campaign.
Thank you very much, Karen. I would like to encourage you to keep the responses a bit short. We have quite a lot of questions and the time is not so much. So the next question is from John Mark and Miko. It's about 3 sets of questions. So the first is whether countries should be, and this is to Chris, Ravi, and Daniel. Should countries be budgeting for micro planning? If they should, how much should the country budget for this? And does it require a lot of training?
Maybe I can start and Chris can join. Because when we started this WHO UNICEF JS working group, I think Karen early in the game, she asked us this question. Is there a way to do the budgeting for this sort of activities? It will be helpful for the donor as well as the country, as well as the implementers. So what we tried to do is we took 3 items together. One is on the various activities which is needed to do the digital microplan at the field level. The second one is what is the capacity of the country to deliver this? Because not all country has the same capacity in the digital drive. So we identify countries as tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And the third one is what are the resources, additional resources or the components needed to drive this in terms of satellite imagery, in terms of footprints, in terms of spatial population. So one is a list of activities which is to be done at the country level. One is the baseline information or the additional resources which are needed. And the third one is the capacity of the country. Mixing these 3, we built a calculator. We are happy to share it. Definitely to your question, you need to accommodate or add that information into your normal budget. It's going to be extra. It needs some training and capacity building as well. Chris?
Nothing to add right now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. The other question is to Karen, and it's from Eva. What are the training requirements for campaign workers when campaigns are fully digitized and for supportive supervision?
Thank you, Eva, for the question. Actually, it will depend what is the role of the person you want to train, because at the lowest level, actually, if it's just to enter the data, it could be just as simple as what you will do, for the training for any people entering the data on your malaria campaign. I guess usually you have someone to collect the data. And in some of this immunization campaign, they just use SMS, because then you have system between Rapid Pro that send data even to the DHIS2 national platform. So it's just about SMS, number of data you distributed, number of data of net you have in stock. It depends what you have. So sending SMS does not add any special training to the normal training. Then for supervisor, you can have a bit more. How do they track the progress report, etc. So it will depend on what is the role of that person in the campaign. What is important is that you integrate this in the same time as the training you do for the campaign. It's just a piece of it.
Great. Thank you for that. The next question is also to Chris, Ravi, and Daniel. So from Mitra, is cost analysis included as part of the pilot in Burundi? This seems to be very limited. There seems to be very limited available information on the specific cost differentials for people-based versus digitally supported campaigns, making it hard to do any sort of cost effectiveness analysis. I believe the question is clear.
Mm-hmm. There is a team working in country that part of their responsibility is to draft a plan for how this may be scaled to the rest of the nation for the rest of the health districts in the country. And they are working on both timing, human resources, and budgeting for that. We don't have the details, and you know, we're supporting from afar, so we're not too close to that. But I would refer people to that team, Fred and Julius and others that are working in Burundi with more details there. In general, I think there's two pieces to this. One is if we're looking at a long-term solution, it would be developing the GIS and geospatial capacity within the country to take on these sorts of programs. And that is a capacity development issue that would have some longer-term goals. And that would be coupled with the specific requirements of a campaign such as this and the mass campaign and building up the surge capacity needed to do this type of work here. So we can help with some of those details. There's not a formula. Each country's needs are going to be different depending on what their current capacity is, as Ravi mentioned, and how far they want to take this. But we can help to bring some clarity there.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a few other questions. Unfortunately, we are a bit over the time, so we won't be going ahead to ask the rest of the questions. However, like I said earlier, the presentations will be shared after this. There's also going to be a focus webinar from AMP on these topics, and we hope that everyone here will be invited to the webinar and we can delve more into the discussions. So thank you once again, Ravi, Chris, Daniel, and Karen for this presentation. We will take a break for about, I think we have just about 8 minutes for the break now, and we'll be back. Thank you once again, and welcome back from the break. And thank you everyone for continuing to stay on this call. So the next set of presentations is basically going to focus on distribution in complex operating environments. For our first presentation, we have it from Joris Lekiwa from DRC. And please, you are reminded to put your questions in the chat, both in French and in English. Also, you can raise your hand when we are doing the discussions. After this, we have another presentation, then the discussions will start. Joris, please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. From the team in DRC, I will give this presentation on the distribution of LLIN in Ituri province. Can we switch to the next slide? Thank you very much. The presentation will be articulated following the points that you see here: the context, objectives, methodology, deployment on the field, the results and outcomes, challenges and possible solutions that we've found, lessons learned, and a conclusion. Next slide, please. Thank you. This distribution had as a target, as an objective, as all mass distribution, the universal covering of households, but in a conflict context with massive displacement of population towards several health zones. And so we have had the necessity to implement a plan determining an implementation module allowing us to attain autochthonous population and displaced population as well, also refugees coming from neighboring countries. And we also had implemented a safety plan for our staff working on the field and nets sending to high-risk zones. Next slide, please. During the distribution period, we had a great part, almost half the zones, the most densely populated area of this province, that was a non-safe zone. You can see it in red in this map, on this map, with a part of the north that was a little bit safer, and the west part, which was safe as well. Please note that we are in a part of DRC that extends for more than 65,000 square kilometers, more than 6 million people living there. But around this province, we had the East Uganda and also the South Sudan, which are, especially South Sudan, were a zone which a lot of political instability that had many refugees from this part of DRC during this distribution phase. Next, please. So in this not safe context, we had to distribute LLIN to everybody, also displaced populations and refugees identified. Specifically, the objective was to identify the displaced population and refugees in the 36 areas of the districts to implement net distribution for refugees, but also to people welcoming these refugees throughout the area. We also had to implement a data collection and information system allowing to have all data from autochthonous population, displaced population in the refugee camps, and also in families welcoming them. Next one. Yeah, thank you. Now, to attain this objective, during the different coordination meetings with the stakeholders, the different teams on the field, and the coordination teams, we have determined 4 kinds of households. Some of them were autochthonous. This would not welcome refugees or displaced population, but we also had autochthonous households hosting displaced people or refugees. But other households were completely made of refugees. There was an abandoned home. They arrived in the health zone because of the unsettling troubles that were in their village of origin. And then we had refugee camps or people coming away towards safe spaces like churches and so on and so forth. So this 4 kinds. As a strategy to distribute nets throughout this area, we had a team of 3 community relays going door to door with an investigator that had a phone to record the people in the household. We would put on paper on a map the size and kind of a household, and the third one had the role to take charge of the transport of the nets to ease the work of the first 2. The best organized refugee sites would be divided in several sectors, with a sector representing 10 to 35 blocks, and each block would have 50 to 60 households. That would allow us to better organize the operations to make available nets to everybody, and also to discuss and implement teams in respect to the needs of the refugee camp. Next one, please. Thank you. During this distribution in Italy, what was important, we work with a open data kit tool, allowing us to put forms on smartphones And so the investigator in each team, there was one investigator with one smartphone collecting the data and putting them online on our server for the real-time follow-up of the distribution data. So we had the smartphone data to be able to compare with the existing data and triangulate before formatting all this data on a database with a model given by the National Program for Malaria. So this is really important. We use ODK system data, regrouping all the villages of the districts and allowing us to collect this data. This prep work was really important to have the means to receive the information and be able to treat them and make sense of them in real time. Second part was the recruitment of the stakeholder. This was a really important part of the work because we had to take into account the displaced populations and the refugee camps, and in order to work right on the camps, we had to recruit people inside of the refugee camp, and so we had to work with the people living in the villages and in the camp that already had information about the households and knowing who welcomed who. At the end, after all the micro planning, we had to carry out a review work of the forecast and update of the data in the most affected area. There were areas that were really struck with Boca Comanda that had a lot of displacement of people towards Venia. Several districts that had people moving towards other parts of the country. Mani also received people from the Angu and Burinkis area. There were a lot of displaced populations. This work was eased through a coordination with the humanitarian stakeholder like OCHA, supporting local organizations like Caritas in Bunia, working already in collaboration with the health team and sharing the data of displaced people with them in order to fine-tune micro-planning that had been finalized previously. Next slide, please. We arrived finally to a total of 1,084,520 autochthonous households recorded that didn't welcome displaced population, displaced people, and autochthonous households that had welcomed displaced people recorded 33,565 of these, and households completely made by displaced people. These were 53,970. In terms of nets distributed to these different types of households, with distributed 851,735. On these received, we distributed 3,558,233 to autochthonous households without displaced people. Those who welcomed people received nets as well, but the data after our assessment showed that in households without displaced people, the average was 1 net for 1.8 people. For the households welcoming displaced people, we had now an average of 2.2 people for each net. And for the households made of displaced people, we had 1.8 people for each net. So after the assessment, we realized that there was a good quality in between the autochthonous households in respect to the displaced people. So there was no discrimination in terms of distribution. Despite of that, we realized that with the capping of nets for each household, so the households welcoming displaced people were not aligned with the others because they had an average of 2.2, as I said. This is something that we've seen, and we use that as a lesson to understand that we had to take into account for households welcoming displaced people of this character to be fairer in the distribution, to have an equal distribution throughout the different types of households. Next slide, please. We also recorded the nets distributed by specific households, so you can see, apart from the autochthonous, like hotels, prisons, churches, and so on and so forth, the other sites receive the higher part of nets. Next slide, please. During this distribution, we encountered a number of challenges. The most important ones were the fact that we had already finished the micro planning, and there were some objections and challenges arising in terms of the integration of displaced people data from our data collection system. Normally, we had a model that we would parameter on our smartphone without discrimination, without specifying if the household was made of displaced people or if the household would host some displaced people. There have been discussion afterwards in order to take into account this data to highlight the importance of displaced people throughout this campaign. This is something that we did till late. We did afterward, after the micro planning. And also these changes in the denominator, it was quite dynamic up until the distribution. There was still some areas that were not safe at all. So the populations on which we would work would move whilst the operation was ongoing, the distribution was ongoing. So we also had to implement additional tools in order to take into account this movement of the population and this difference in the population, autochthonous or displaced. And so we need further tools in order to take to implement the distribution. But the greatest challenge was the differences in terms of distribution in the different areas, and this in terms of logistics and deployment was a great challenge during the distribution. And finally, in terms of stigmatization, how to win people reticence in order for them to declare their refugee or displaced status, because it was a risk of creating differences in the community. So we needed to take into account this in the choosing of the people asking them and working on the field. It had to be someone they trusted. And to respond to this challenge, we worked on the integration of the modification, namely in terms of tools, but also in terms of identifying the team working on the field in order to be able to receive the best possible data and the best acceptances from the households. So we had to update the stakeholders, the different people in the teams, whilst the micro planning, as I said, had already been done. So we need to redeploy inside and outside the health zone, and that's why we had with the national program taken the initiative of starting the different operation in different times. For instance, in Bunia in particular, which is the capital of the province, this part of the country received the most of displaced people. So we launched the operation at the same time throughout all the sites. We had a provincial deployment committee in order to coordinate, and so we were able to start operation at a different time in the different area and to keep the nets in the central office in order to be able to supply all of them and avoid a lack of nets. During this time, the area of Boga received a second operation of more than 1,000 nets after assessing their needs. And these nets were brought to finalize the distribution campaign. We had the same situation of lack of stock in Kampa and Lola from the fourth day, and some other quantities of a neighboring area have been deployed in order to finalize the campaign in these two areas and to cover the total of the households in the province. Next slide, please. What we understood of this distribution, the lessons we learned, is the categorization of the households from the beginning and the taking into account of the type of households in the data collection allowed to facilitate, to ease the micro planning in this kind of deployment in difficult areas. This also allows to have more complete data. Also, the displaced population information, in order to realize, as we did, to ensure equality in the deployment. And finally, vulnerable population, displaced population, we realized that their vulnerability was a cross vulnerability, because during the activities, during the deployment, the data OCHA had at the time said that we had 2 million in terms of displaced population, but 1 million the people that came back. So precarity was the same for displaced population and for population that went back to their original village. And the coverage of all these people was necessary in order to hope to have an optimal covering of the population. The distribution of nets in this difficult situation was really something that had to be taken into account, taking into account population that were displaced and population that were in the process of going back to their original village. And so prevention against malaria, which is an important strategy for all the population in intense transmission areas like this one, it becomes even more important in case of unsafety, and to work with the teams for the acceptance of population is one of the most important levers to be successful in this process. So in conclusion, next slide, please.
Bien gérer les déploiements volontaires. De bien gérer les déploiements.
Conclude, we can say that it is crucial to well manage the rollout of and the distribution of the different nets in these health areas. It is also very important to protect the team on the ground, and a good coordination is really a key element for this type of campaign in such context. With what we managed to implement, we do believe that we now have leverage to improve the next campaign, the coming campaigns in other similar contexts, and that will be beneficial to the population on the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doris, for this wonderful presentation. We'll go to the next presentation from Linus Bernstein from Flowminder, which is on improving prevention by understanding population mobility and displacement using mobile operator data. Linus, over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me just share screen here. So I'm Linus Bengtsson. I'm the chair of the board of Flowminder and one of the founders. And I'll talk about how we can understand mobility and displacement using mobile operator data. And mobility and displacement are extremely difficult to monitor and to quantify. And in especially low-income countries, mobile operator data is really our best bet, and I'll talk about that. I'm not a malaria specialist by any means, so my focus is mobility and displacement, but I do think there's quite a lot we can that can give inspiration for malaria work as well. Flowminder, we're a foundation, a non-profit. We work with a lot of governments, intergovernmental organizations supporting humanitarian and development purposes. I have a background in global health and started in Haiti after the earthquake in 2010, where I came up with the idea of using mobile operator data, and that became a very successful tool for the response back in 2010, and that gave the impetus to create Flowminder and scale these types of analysis across different sectors. We do a lot of academic and method work on using this data for understanding mobility, and the last couple of years we really started to cover the whole value chain, from the collaboration with the mobile operator, the legal issues, the open source software to analyze and access the data, and critically the tools to communicate clear insights to decision makers. And just to give you some indication of where we work, so these are countries where we are working or have been working with mobile operator data over the years. And we're of course happy to start new partnerships. So mobile operator data, what is that? It is data that mobile operators are recording on a routine basis because they want to bill you. So even if you have a prepaid card and you make a call, the mobile operator will register the mobile phone tower that was used, and the phone number, and the time of the call, and to whom the call was made. And if you, we always analyze this data in de-identified format, so we don't have access to any individual identification, but knowing the mobile phone tower then enables us if a person makes a call from one place, then moves, make a call from another place, and that call is connected from another mobile phone tower, that enables us to be able to deduce that there has been a movement. And in practical terms, this is how the data actually looks. De-identified data with millions to billions of rows with different events. And from this, you can then deduce mobility. A few words on one of the most important things, privacy. It's very sensitive data, even if you don't have the personal identifier in the data. And the way we work is that we always move the code to the data. We never get the data out of the operator where it is safely stored. We are a European entity based in Stockholm and UK and Switzerland, and we are then following the very stringent GDPR European data privacy regulation. We also provide the code in open software and open methods, and publish in peer-reviewed journals as often as we can to make everything we do transparent. So there's an obvious. So it sounds good. We can follow all these phones. That sounds good. But of course there are challenges, and I'll talk a bit more about the analysis slightly later. But I just wanted to flag that a very important part of the work is to try to account for biases, because not everybody has a mobile phone, and we work with one operator in each country. Sometimes we work with more, but usually it's just one. And there may be differences between between subscribers of different operators. And then some people just call too seldomly for us to get meaningful data out of their use. So whenever there is resources, we try to have surveys or micro censuses where we can try to adjust for these biases. Happy to talk more about that. So going into a bit more on concrete analysis that could be relevant for malaria prevention. The first thing is just that we are able to approximately understand differences in population density between different time points. So we see this is in the Port-au-Prince metropolitan area in Haiti. And here we see in daytime, the population is heavily concentrated in two areas of the urban, in the urban area, to urban centers, while then at nighttime, the population is then distributing itself outwardly. This is on very short time frames, so day and night, but of course this also takes place over longer time periods, and this is perhaps more relevant for malaria prevention. This is data from Namibia, where we work with the operator MTC, and the analysis here is from my colleagues in the WorldPop team at the University of Southampton. The circles you see on the map are estimated coverage areas of health facilities, and you see the graphs. So this one, for example, if you see my cursor, the blue one shows for each month the estimated number of people in that catchment area of that health facility. And as you can see, these vary quite a lot over the year. In some areas, it doesn't vary very much. In some areas, you see very big variations over the year. And so this can, of course, be used to understand your target population better, the denominators, potentially for ITN distribution, but or improved incidence estimates. That covered situations that are kind of stable and regular. But then we, of course, have situations like Joris was talking about here. It was, thanks, Joris, it was a very nice talk, and we work in DRC, and I think that would be very interesting to discuss more. So we can, in a situation where we have a crisis, there's data from a number of disasters. We worked, for example, in Nepal in 2015, and then we could very rapidly after this large earthquake see where people went from the earthquake area and where they ended up. To the right, we see the same type of data from 2 disasters in Haiti. And this is data from DRC in the Goma area, where we worked last year during the very large volcano eruption that took place outside Goma, where a big part of the population of Goma left the city to flee the eruption. And we can then follow these movements and provide information about where people are going. And we saw the presentation before, very nice by Ravi and Chris and Daniel from WHO. I remember seeing that. I added this at the very last minute here, this slide. It's Ravi, you showed, I think, the Mogadishu IDP population that you mapped, and a very nice complement, I think, is, so we did something similar here. This was following a cyclone in Bangladesh, and we see the Chittagong area. It's an area of about 8 million people, and we could then take all the phones that had previously been in the cyclone area, and we could see how they were distributed in, because a lot of people, they went to this area, to the urban area, and we could then see how they are distributed in the urban landscape. I think mobile data is never completely the final answer, but I think it gives a very good starting base for going further in these mapping exercises. And if you don't have anything else, it's probably much better than just guessing, of course. Let's see. So I think that was the what I wanted to share, that I thought was relevant, most relevant. There is also the possibility to do much more advanced modeling of parasite movements and much better understand what areas are sources of parasites and what areas are sinks of parasites, since parasites, of course, travel largely inside people. That requires quite advanced modeling competences, and I didn't go into that here, but we're very happy to collaborate with others who are interested in doing such modeling exercises to better understand areas to target that are sources of parasite exportation. So I finish there and happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linus, and thank you, Doris. May I invite Doris to join, and maybe also Debbie, as we go through the discussion session. So I'll start with the first question, that is to Doris. How much delay was there between the original dates and the dates that the distribution took place? What would you recommend for DRC to act quickly, given that many provinces have areas of insecurity? Also, what was the overall population increase or decrease? Yeah, so Doris, this is a question from Jessica to you. Doris, if you are talking, you're on mute.
Oui, ce serait bien de. J'ai pas bien saisi cette partie de.
Could you repeat the question? It wasn't very clear to me.
Okay. The question is, how much delay was there between the original dates and the dates that the distribution took place? what would you recommend for DRC to act quickly, given that many of the provinces have areas of insecurity? Also, what was the overall population increase or decrease?
So Robert, we'll just wait a minute for the interpretation into French for Joris.
Alors,
Vous avez bien...
je peux y aller?
Très bien, merci, ouais.
I will go ahead. I think that, well, we were working in a region where the central part of the region, it was the most impacted part. The north was insecure and the south was secure. We saw big differences between the different health areas. So some health areas were completely emptied and the population had almost completely fled the region. For example, in Boga. And in Condé, for example, the population multiplied. So in the end, in terms of population change inside the province, there was not a big gap, a big change. Because the exchanges were going from one health zone to another. Maybe I could share my screen for the global map of the movement of the Ituri population. That'd be great, so this could illustrate. Can you see my screen? Yes, perfect. So if you can see here, regarding the internally displaced people, you can see that a big part of the displaced population reached 443,000. In the same territory, you had 400,000 of people who returned to the region. So it creates a balance. And the same goes on for the Mahagi region. So you have movements back and forth, staying in the same health area or from a health area to another. In the end, there was not a huge gap within the province, but there was a big difference from a health area to another. So how can we react efficiently and rapidly? Well, I said it, the key element was the collaboration with humanitarian workers and our teams in the different health areas. Each responsibilities were distributed to the different teams, and we also were working with different organizations, closely working with them. As we shared the information in real time with them, this allowed us to have a great cooperation on the ground. And this also helped us to save a lot of time during the preparation of the campaigns. That's my answer. I hope I answered the question correctly. Thank you.
Okay, Robert, would you like me to ask the next question to Joris for you? Just checking in.
Can you ask the next question?
No problem. Okay, so Joris, quelle a été votre expérience concernant...
So the question is, what has been your experience in the use of smartphone in an unsafe area, for instance, a geographical data collection for people created some particular challenges? So the use of what? I didn't understand. Using smartphones. Do I have to repeat the question? Yes, could you repeat, please? What has been your experience in use of smartphones in an unsafe context? For instance, in the geographical localization of the people, did it create some particular worry? Is a question from Actaras. Excellent question. Thank you very much. In the beginning, there was a little bit of worry, especially in displaced populations. But the strategy that we have implemented in order to reduce this worry and risk at the minimum, as I said, was the selection of the stakeholders. So means that the people using smartphones would be people coming from their group of people. For instance, when we would go to refugee camps, people using smartphones were people living in the refugee camp. So it was people that were informed and trained on how to use the smartphones, but they would leave with this displaced people and refugees. So we had representatives from the refugee camp that were with us, people in the field. And this has been really useful in order to reassure the population and having them accept the teams on the field and allowing for data collection. They were more accepted during the prep phase with their communication, and we would inform these people, train them, and they would go back to their communities and explain what they were doing. And so the worry and the lack of acceptance was avoided and data could be collected. This information was really useful because at the end of the daily distribution, the teams of IMA and IT would produce maps on Google Maps, allowing us to see, because they had a map of the movement from one village to another on 7 days. So we knew that some villages had been covered, others didn't. So the map produced at the end would allow to understand if some households were not visited. And that would be really interested for the second passage that had been missed the previous day. That's what I can tell about the use of these smartphones.
Thank you, Joris. The next question is to Linus, and this is from Miko. So one of the challenges we have with ITN campaigns is urban distribution. Could this data support better understanding of movement to and from urban areas for planning purposes?
Thank you. I think so. Again, I say I'm not a ITN distribution expert, but we do see as a very strong movement in cities, right? And especially in urban slums, you have a turnover of the population which is very, very fast and quite different from higher income areas in a city. And you have, of course, a flow into the city and out seasonally. So I would imagine understanding how often you should reach an area, depending on how often the population is the turnover time of the population, and maybe for distributing messages, where are sort of information hubs, mobility hubs in the city. I'm sure it would help, but probably a back and forth would be good.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Linus. So we now have another question in French. So c'est une question de Yatara.
It is a question from Yatara. I'd like to know if there have been any interaction or negotiation with the militia, and what did you do concretely to distribute in the control area? Did you understand the question, or should I repeat, Dr. Joris?
there's a slight delay because Joris is in the French interpretation booth. We're just going to wait a second. Je répète la question.
Ah non, je pensais que c'était une question qui était destinée à...
I thought it was a question for somebody else. So I will repeat then. A question from Oyatara. I'd like to know if there have been interaction or negotiation with the militia and what the PNLP concretely did to distribute in the control area. Okay, thank you very much. There were areas controlled by the militia, but in these areas, we needed to work with the people who are accepted by the community. Generally, even before the campaign, our teams negotiate with the chiefs of the militia in order to create some corridors to have access to the population. And during the prep work of the campaign, we asked the team of the militia to send some candidates for distribution. So we had some community relays that were proposed by these militia coming from the area under their control in order to be briefed and informed. And then they go back with the NATs. And it's also important to have some village chiefs on the other hand, delegating some people of coming directly in order to ensure information to the population. This was the key. First of all, negotiation with the chiefs of the militias to obtain access and send people in the area, and also the need to have some village chiefs or people delegated from them in order to have the right information and to have the right access to the population. This is what has allowed us to be able to go in the field, go through these territories and have the support of the militia in order to fulfill our mission.
Great. Thank you, Joris, for sharing this wonderful experience. I think the next question will go to Linus. And this is from Joe Lewinsky. I'll just read as it is. This might be a basic question, but I'm wondering how Flowminder thinks modeling methodology changes between acute versus protracted emergencies. Yes.
Thanks. Not at all a basic question, very difficult. So if we just want to follow sort of normal movements, things are slightly more straightforward because we can look at the phones, they go back and forth, and we can then with surveys try to adjust, sort of, we call it scaling up to the population. That has its difficulties, but somewhat straightforward. When it comes to displacement, we want to understand which people are displaced and which are not displaced. So in many settings, the normal mobility between two places are much larger than displacement. It depends if it's conflict, it can be huge displacement, but often the displacement is a bit of a trickle that can go on for a very long time and give rise to very big numbers in total. But what we try to do is to understand the individual trajectories of those people if they have made a change to their normal mobility according to some criteria we set up, and which would lead us to decide that they are displaced rather than just carrying on their normal mobility. So there's a lot to say about that. Yeah, feel free to reach out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think the next question is to Joris. I'll invite Debbie to ask.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so c'est une question pour Joris maintenant.
So it's a question for Joris from David. Taking into account this difficult environment, do you think that the nets have been efficient as a battle in fighting against the vector? And what recommendation would you make, please? I think it was really important, this distribution campaign. So the nets, we have seen that it's part of a kit that the households would always have when traveling, when being displaced. So when the households would come back to their original place, they would come back with the nets. So this possibility to bring this net with you, and we think that that is really important for displaced population, so they can bring 2-3 nets with them. They don't wait a lot, and they can be protected wherever they stop. So it's really important in order to protect these population, because it's easy to transport. It can be easy to be used as even an emergency when you stop for the night, even during the displacement. So I think that the net in this kind of situation, unsafe situation, and mobility of the population and displacement of the population is a really good tool for vector, for fighting against the vector. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, both Linus and Joris, for these wonderful presentations and the discussions. We've exhausted the time for the discussion period, so we move on to the next presentation. However, there are some few questions that were not answered in the chat, so if you have time, you can just go through the questions and answer them in the chat. So for our next presentation will be from Eliza Warren Jones, who will be presenting on the PBONet deep dive, market landscape, and short-term forecast for ITNs. Great. Once again, please put your questions in the chat. After this, there will be a short discussion.
Thanks, Robert. And a few of you will have seen this this presentation before. It's a shorter version of one that we presented on the AMP Partners call, but I think there's a few pieces in here related to some of the conversations this week. So just wanted to kind of reference some of the assumptions made here. I'm going to be presenting on a summary of findings from our 2021 PBONet deep dive report. This was a report that was put out by the Global Malaria Commodities Forecasting Consortium, which is led by CHAI in coordination and consortium with these partners down here, and supported by a steering committee of additional partners, kind of representing major donors and policymakers and technical partners within the malaria commodities space. This forecasting project aims to just kind of help organise some of the information out there around the potential future of the malaria commodities market, as kind of in recognition of the kind of increasing complexity that we're seeing within these markets, especially with COVID-19 related disruptions that are kind of ongoing, and some of the other kind of key pieces that are coming through at the moment. We have three major outputs from these projects. From this project. One is the short-term procurement forecast, which has fed into today's presentation. I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. These longer-term forecasts of need and demand, which we'll be publishing the first of in June of this year, and deep dive reports on the market landscape for specific commodities. And last year that topic was on PBONets. I'll add a link after I've done the presentation to the dashboard where all of this information and some more detail on the methods is also available. And thanks to Gates for funding this project. For the PBONet deep dive report more broadly, the aim here was to really highlight kind of what the key factors may be that would influence PBONet volumes in the future, and also to kind of unpack some of the key factors that have influenced uptake so far, to kind of help with lessons learned for other commodities that are emerging into the market. It was a report that was compiled by CHAI with assistance from IBCC and a number of other partners, and included kind of a fairly extensive desk review process and a lot of informational interviews. So thank you to all of those who contributed. There's a list at the end, but there were many. And just briefly to mention that although this is a deep dive focused on PBONets, we can't talk about them in silos. So just recognizing that we also have looked at through this process kind of where the market may be going for pyrethroid only standard nets and dual AI nets as well. And this slide, I think, is pretty linked to some of the other presentations that have been happening today, but we are generally seeing for PBO nets that there is an evidence base there, but this is still growing. So there's still outstanding questions around kind of the impact of design differences on the performance of different PBO nets, around some of the geographies for that they're being deployed in, and the potential implications of that on impact of PBO nets. The questions around net durability that were raised earlier, the cost effectiveness of PBO nets in comparison to other types of nets. And then finally, the updates to the WHO interim recommendation. So those of you that were on the MPAG, WHO MPAG meeting the other day will have seen that there's kind of been some updates by the WHO recently, and that we're also expecting to hear if there'll be kind of any further updates around the dual AI net recommendation over the coming year. So just briefly on the kind of historical market landscape for PBO nets, we saw this really quick uptake by countries since the WHO conditional recommendation in 2017. At the time that we published this report, this was based on data through to Q3 of 2021. This is actually even higher once you factor in the data from John Milliner on including Q4. I think it was 44% of PBO nets in 2021 shipped were 44% of nets shipped in 2021 were PBO. And interestingly, for the highest volume PBO net countries, we're also seeing that this kind of uptake primarily occurred since 2020, and that kind of a big factor behind that was the increased malaria allocation from Global Fund in that funding cycle. In addition to kind of the uptake factors, we have a number of kind of supply questions and considerations that will influence future uptake, as well as kind of have influenced prior uptake. So part of that is around PBO sourcing and supply. There are only 2 WHO approved manufacturers for PBO raw material. Plastics pricing is an ongoing situation that's evolving. Last year, we saw a rise in global oil prices that led to a 42% increase in ethylene prices. That's likely to be shifting even more this year, given some of the kind of current world events, and is something that we'll be tracking through the course of this project. Fluctuations in PBO net demand and order volumes that make it difficult for manufacturers to plan effectively. Quality assurance and quality control questions, which I think we'll also be talking about during the course of these meetings. And then the COVID-related freight challenges, which we're also seeing continuing through into this year. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So what we aim to do from this information is to produce a couple of forecasts around what this is likely to mean for the trajectory of the ITN market going forwards, and especially for PBO nets. And just very briefly, the way that I'll just talk through a little bit how the way that we did this, but just very briefly, the kind of key data sources that we had used for this project were kind of publicly available data from Global Fund, information from PMI around procurements and also their costing assumptions, information that we have available around kind of what country plans look like, and especially thinking around kind of product choices moving forwards, and kind of coverage targets. And then also utilizing some of the other data sources that I think some of which have already come up today, but the AMP net mapping project and then the mass campaign tracker. And we put these into our forecast kind of through looking at what was planned in terms of distributions, both for mass campaigns and routine distribution from 2021 through 2023. And then updating that to 2024, adjusting based on population growth for areas previously covered, in addition to adding a kind of average based on the routine distribution estimates for 2021 through 2023. That gave us our total volumes for product selection, and we then broke that down into the different net types, so the standard nets, PBO nets and dual AI nets, based on what countries had specified their net preferences were, information that we had around available budget, and then looking at the involvement of countries in initiatives such as the New Nets project and the Net Transition Initiative that would also influence product choice. And we then looked at a few scenarios that may influence these overall projections, and I'll talk about those in a second as well. But just broadly, we bucketed these factors into kind of a few key areas. One is really around the budget impact, so looking at kind of available donor funding, but also thinking about both country and donor funding priorities. I should mention that this forecast for this year was kind of primarily focused on donor funded procurement, but we are looking to make our update this year also adjust that so that we can kind of include other data sources to better capture kind of domestic funding as well. Some of these changes around price that I've kind of mentioned already, and then also considering the kind of comparative price of different types of nets. And then looking at kind of the WHO recommendations and other recommendations coming through and shifts in insecticide resistance and their potential impact. I should just caveat with our projection, which is this is our kind of primary projection for this forecast, that we are still looking into some of the assumptions from this report, and we will be updating them accordingly. I think some of them are kind of not entirely tracking with what we're seeing coming through at the moment, and so we're looking if we need to adjust some of the assumptions that have been made here, and we'll update that on the forecasting dashboard accordingly. I'm also not going to go into the details of the numbers right now because I don't think we have time. But I just wanted to talk about a couple of the kind of broader trends that we projected. So I think the first key one here is just to call out that we had estimated that PBO nets would probably peak in their market share around 2022. This is partly kind of as newer types of nets, so the dual AI nets will come onto the market and start to kind of galvanize some of that market share. The other thing that kind of I think is that we have been assuming, which is a kind of key assumption that we're looking at the moment for this project, is that nets will primarily be distributed in 3-year distribution cycles, and so we're not necessarily seeing this trend track from year on year, but rather every kind of 3 years as countries kind of move through their process. We looked at calculating kind of a weighted average price, and this is a weighted average price based on an average across donors based on volumes that were projected during that time. And I should just note that the prices here are kind of ex works, and by that what we're just really saying here is that this isn't including the commodity cost, so this is what we're projecting that the raw commodity cost would, sorry, the raw price of the actual LLIN product would be. We then looked at what would happen if we saw some changes in our kind of key assumptions there, and so here we looked at kind of the budget replenishment scenario. So what if we saw a higher than expected budget replenishment for the next global fund cycle in line with what we had seen previously? And the main conclusion that we came to here is that if countries had kind of more available budget to kind of procure through donors, that they would primarily focus on shifting to PBO nets and dual AI nets based on kind of what we've been hearing around where some of those markets may be going. And so we may see some kind of increase in overall volumes, but primarily this would help to shift more strongly to the newer markets. And there we go, and the slides. And the second thing that we looked at was the pricing scenarios. And so for this, we looked at both what would happen if we did see some of the kind of reflected cost increase that were being discussed towards the end of last year, and which I think we kind of are seeing coming through this year. And then also what would happen if budgets were kind of further constrained by the countries by increased freight costs that weren't able to be kind of absorbed by other components of the budget. Again, this kind of looks at this 15% increase, which was an estimate that we had included at the time based on conversations with partners around what might be the kind of higher range of price increases. This is 15% on the price of standard nets, but applied to all nets. So in real terms, that translates to a 30% increase from 2022 going through to 2024, with kind of some rebalancing according to previous market projections. And the expectation here is that countries may not want to switch back to standard nets having transitioned to PBO nets, but that they may look at targeting the areas that they are deploying nets in further. And so in this situation, our projections are really that we would expect countries to kind of reduce their overall numbers of nets and target kind of areas more strongly with the kind of nets that they already have that are more appropriate. I should call out here in 2024, in 2022, this additional column based on price plus freight increase. And really what we're saying here is that we expect the budget to be constrained further, and so that this would lead to an even kind of bigger decrease in the total volumes being provided. Yeah, so just to kind of sum up on the key takeaways, based on country requests and anticipated need, we expect the market share PBO nets to peak around 2022, and that we should start seeing kind of more of an increase in dual AI nets as well from 2022 to 2024. We have assumed for this forecast that by 2024 there won't be ongoing supply constraints on the dual AI side, and that in scenarios where increased funding was available, we would expect countries who would like to switch to PBO or dual AI nets to switch more quickly. But in scenarios where we would see more constrained funding going forwards, that we may not expect countries to shift back to standard nets if that meant that they would be unable to kind of respond to some of the resistance identified within areas. I'm not going to go into the long-term drivers here, but there's kind of a section of this within the full report, which I'll add the link to, and kind of some preliminary modelling on resistance. I should just call out that we are kind of reviewing that methodology for the updates that will be coming through in June. So just wanted to finish up by saying a big thank you to everyone who contributed to this report, including Marcy, and yeah, again, thank you to Gates for the input. I'll add the link to the dashboard here, but please also feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and more broadly, we have a kind of a dedicated email address for any questions or comments that may come up further down the line around the PBO Net Deep Dive report or the kind of broader forecast, or feel free to please kind of message me directly.
Thank you, Eliza, and just please stay on as we go through a few questions that have come through. This question is from John Mark. Assuming we see a shift in line with the new global fund policy to more sustained distribution through continual distribution, how would the forecasting be affected between annual and the 3-year campaign cycles?
Yeah, thank you, John Mark. That's it's a really good question. It's one that we're trying to unpack at the moment for the longer term forecast. I think when we looked at the short-term forecast, it didn't seem that we were expecting to see such a significant shift within the next 3 years that we kind of prioritize that as one of the scenarios. But it is something that we're kind of looking into now. I think the expectation is that obviously would need to adjust the year-on-year elements, but also to think about the kind of shifting expectations of need in line with kind of continuous distribution, as kind of I think Hannah was talking about earlier. So more to come on that. I'm sorry, that's not a very full answer for right now.
Thank you, Eliza, for the response. So I think that's the question I see in the chat, but we still have some few minutes. So if anyone have any other pressing question, you may please raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay. I think that should be all. Yes, great. Thanks so much for this wonderful presentation. And we look forward to as Eliza said, the presentations will be shared. Also, their contacts and email addresses. If you have any specific question to that, you may be able to send a question to her. Okay, great. Thank you. So I think we've come to the last session or the last presentation of the day. And just as a wrap up, I would like to just give a very brief overview of what has transpired today. But first of all, I want to thank you all, especially to our presenters, for this wonderful and insightful presentations. And also a very big thank you to all the participants who have stayed on from the beginning up to this time, and even for those who couldn't stay up to the end, but were part of the presentations. Thank you all for making it possible and for being available for today's presentation. So as a way of wrap up, I think we started the day with a presentation from Marcy and Mary on ITN and ITN trackers, basically on continual distribution. and mass campaign trackers. And there was a brief overview on what these are the requirements and what we expect from various countries and national programs. The ITN campaign tracker is available on the AMP website. You may please check for further information on the tracker. We also had a presentation from Amelia from IDM on the modeling potential drivers of ITN coverage gaps, where she talks a lot about some of the gaps in ITN, and especially a question on why access is low, making reference to allocation challenges, retention time being shorter than 3 years in some of the countries that ITNs are deployed. We had another presentation from Hannah, which was more or less a build up to the presentation on what Amelia had done, which also talked about different nets that are needed for different types of levels and recommended CD quantifications for countries in order to achieve the right sustained level of coverage for various countries. We also had a presentation from Gavi, which was delivered by Karen, basically focusing on data microplanning or the use of geospatial data for decision-making. She also highlighted on dashboards that are available and the use of effective subnational data for decision-making at the local level. Data supply chain, there was also a highlight on the real-time monitoring tool which have been adopted. She gives some samples of various case studies that they have done, which is available, the report, and some of the links were also shared in the chat for those who want to follow up. Again, we had a presentation from WHO team or the GIS Center for Health from Chris, Ravi, and Daniel, a very wonderful presentation on the geo-enabling microplanning and also geographic accessibility modality or the use of population for various modeling in terms of doing microplanning. Again, there was a demonstration on how the data was used in Somalia and also the current or ongoing work that is being done in Burundi. Again, they had requested that if you have any information, you can contact them, and the slides will be available with their details, their detailed information for any further information. Then we had a presentation from DRC delivered by Joris on the challenges of distribution to COEs or refugees or displaced population. He highlighted on the use of data tools for this and also how they were able to compare various existing data with the available data or the data that they registered in order to triangulate it to have accurate information to do the distribution. He highlighted some few challenges about the approach or what and some of the lessons that they had. Then we had another presentation from Linus from Flowminder on improving prevention by understanding population mobility and displacement using the mobile operator data. So this again, Linus highlighted on how the mobile data is being used to be able to capture data on population, on mobile population, and how campaigns or various programs can take advantage of this data to do maybe proper planning or micro planning. The last presentation which had just ended was a presentation from Elisa on the PBO net deep dive, which is just a presentation about the global malaria commodities forecasting. And she talks about the long-term and the short-term or the medium-term supply and the factors that are affecting or influencing the PBO in the market, some of them including the plastic pricing and also various factors like global fund grant or global fund funding cycles and how this will affect the market for PBOs in the coming years. So in all, we had about 8 different presentations for the day, and I would like to thank our presenters once again. And before we end, I would like you to just help us to answer a few questions or to provide some feedback on the lesson, on the various sessions for the day. So as we did from the beginning, we are going to use the Menti. So you go on to www.menti.com, www.menti.com. If you are there on the link, you will see you have to enter the code 8469 5042 5042 8469 5042. Debbie, can I have the questions? So there are just about few questions. One of them we'd like to know how satisfied you were with today's AMP partners meeting. How satisfied you were with today's partners meeting. So if you've been able to log in, please kindly answer these questions for us. I'll just give about a minute for people to do it. Great, we're starting to see some responses. Very satisfied. Great, please, you can keep doing it as we move to the next question. How would you reach the relevance of the sessions today to your own work? How would you reach the relevance of the sessions today to your own work? Yes, we have greater or majority of people saying very relevant. Very good to hear that the sessions are relevant to our work. Great. Let's keep the responses coming. If you've not been able to do it, you can keep doing it. Debbie, maybe we can go to the next and the last question. Which of today's sessions were most helpful for you in your daily work? So this question, you need to rank up to 3, starting with the most helpful choice first. So you have about 5 options based on the various topics or presentations that were conducted. So you rank them based on which one you think. Great. So we have first, innovation for achieving campaign targets. Very good to hear that on micro planning, digitization, amongst others. You have technical updates coming next. You have country focused presentations. Yes, research and education updates is going up. Yeah, very good to have your feedbacks. Technical updates again, then country focused presentations. So once again, I would like to thank you all for taking or making time to participate in this meeting. The meeting is a 3-day event. Today is the first day. Tomorrow we are continuing with the topic or the theme on scaling up new ITN types, starting at the same time, and we hope to see you all at the meeting. All the presentations and the various meeting output or all the recordings will be available on the AMP website after this event. So once again, thank you all very much for participating in today's meeting. See you all tomorrow.